Where's the video camera?
Right here.
Oh, okay. You want the tripod?
No, not yet. Okay, Dad, your face is big good. Dad, it needs to be on the circle, the closed circle.
Yeah. You got a flag in front of it.
I don't see Edward Jimmy's face. I don't see him. Hold the flag that way. That'll work.
Oh, yes, I know.
Get the best picture from where we stand.
Now, I have to point this out. The veterans actually put the, well, the commission put this, don't go on this rock sign, the one people use to climb up on the rock. And the reason became clear to me for the first time last year. Part of it is don't touch the monument, but actually there's more to it. If you notice right in front of Warren's feet, it's about as straight a drop-off as here. And 2 years ago when I was giving a tour up here, a fellow proved to me why that sign is there, because he was trying to take a picture of Warren's face, and he just kind of right over the back, and I said, that's why they put that there. Which is neat, because they didn't have cameras really back then that you could carry around. So they had to support that. Well, this fellow here used to be the hero of Little Round Top in PM days. In Gettysburg, we did pre-movie and post-movie, and in pre-movie days, he was the hero of Little Round Top, and now nobody really knows who he is anymore. And so, here he is at Gettysburg, and this is where we begin our tour. What I'm going to do is just kind of do the basic old Park Service tour I used to give every day, but stop along the way and point out a bunch of different things. For those of you who've done this every year, what the heck are you thinking at 7 o'clock this morning? But to do the regular tour for those who haven't been on our little jaunt here, and then stop at all the interesting. We'll tell you about the stone they accidentally blew out of the 44th New York Monument one year, and the artificial, not really dinosaur footprint, and all kinds of interesting little things up here that a lot of folks don't really know about. The various roads that have been built and a lot of other things. So we'll try to take little side trips off of our regular tour to look at interesting little tidbits, why the 16th Michigan's facing the wrong way, and lots of other interesting tidbits along the way. Because I found, since I moved to Gettysburg a couple years ago, that the side stories to the battle are as fascinating at times as the actual battle. Why this monument is there and the one that used to be there isn't, and how come it's so big even though that regiment hardly ever fired a shot, and why is there a great big monument with flank markers to a unit that wasn't even here, and all kinds of stuff. So I've found that sort of memorialization, those of you who've read Carol Reardon's new book about Pickett's Charge have gotten a sense of what historians have become very enamored of lately, and that is not so much the event, but the people who recorded the event up until yesterday. And that history has a lot more to do with the people recording it than what they're recording. And so it's a lot of fun to talk about monuments and roads and how the veterans and people afterwards have tried to commemorate and interpret the battle, and how we screwed up completely or gotten off the track and so on and so forth. But the one key theme to all these talks I used to give, because tourists always used to have a good time when they asked where the Liberty Bell was, or how come all the battles were fought in national parks, was that a rule, and how did they get the bullet holes out of the monuments after the fight was over, and how did they stop traffic, who put these rocks here, were they here at the time of the battle? So when you deal with folks like that on a regular basis, you can't talk about left flanks and right flanks the whole time, because people look at you really funny and then go. But they're good sports. I've given tours here as cold as 20 degrees for the Friends, and one day that hottest day in the history of Pennsylvania, July 15th, a couple years ago, it was 112 degrees. The heat index was 122, and danged if I didn't have 12 people when I started and 15 when we ended. But I wasn't as bad because Eric Campbell had to give a tour of the wheat field that day. They're in the tree in that thing. Poor guy. Eric's like running from tree to tree. But it's amazing how people come, and it's a good estimation. No one ever sits here with a counter and takes numbers. But this is most likely the most visited Civil War site in America. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I've held that one of them is the Sunset's beautiful as a parking lot. And if they put a restroom here, we double visitation up here on the hill. Because again, popularity of places has a lot more to do with modern things than it really does with the history that actually happened. For example, everyone who comes to Little Round Top stands on this part of the hill. But there was really no fighting over here. It was all way over there, where very few people go. And so a lot more has to do with the way the park has put in roads and interpretive signs over the last 100 and some years than really what actually happened. And people come here and go, is that Chamberlain? And I'm like, well, no, he's over there. And then they go and come back and say, well, I didn't find him. I'm like, we got to cross the road. Well, nothing happened back there. There's woods back there. So it's funny how people get perspectives from movies and TV, and they come. A lot of people read The Killer Angels, come and look at Pickett's Charge and go, where's the big hill? Because the way Shara describes it, you think there's a big hill, and it's just visually not that imposing a ridge, really, unless you think of old-fashioned military tactics. So, but the theme is really that Gettysburg, unlike really any other place in America, is a multiple-choice battlefield. And by that I mean, and I'll point out along the way, that if you don't like a particular version of events, most of you may have discovered already, if you just keep reading, you'll find one that contradicts it fairly shortly afterwards. And we even have multiple-choice monuments, which I'll try and show you along the way, in addition to ones with horses with tree trunks growing out of their stomachs. And as I said, the 84th Pennsylvania with flank markers, and they weren't even here. So this is where our flanks weren't during the Battle of Gettysburg. But it's a fun and interesting battlefield, not so much because of what the veterans did per se, but because of what people over the years have done to try and commemorate it rightly or wrongly. And the Tom Berenger Monument is the latest development. A hat Longstreet never wore and a beard he certainly never had, but it looks a lot like the movie, and that's what we got to do. So that's another example of how the people who make the monument make a monument about what's going on in their time, not about what happened during the battle, because it's all about us in the modern sense. And that's what historians get a big kick out of these days, studying Margaret Mitchell's time when they studied Gone with the Wind, not studying the Civil War during Gone with the Wind. So anyway, and our multiple choice tour begins with our friend Gouverneur, which I've learned recently is how you used to pronounce it, Gouverneur K. Warren, which is, his men used to call him Goo, which I thought was remarkably close to Goof, which is not something you want to call a general, but they called him Goo. And this is his statue. Now Warren began his Civil War portion of his military career, or at least prior to coming to Gettysburg, had been in command of what we think of as Weed's brigade. And he had been an infantry commander, but Meade made him his chief engineer. Warren, of course, high in his class at West Point, got to choose one of the three branches, engineering, artillery, or infantry. And if you graduated high, you always chose engineering. And so he came to Gettysburg as Meade's chief engineer, which essentially doesn't really have a whole lot of battle applications. In other words, engineers, take care of pontoons and fortifications and this and that. They generally don't order artillery and infantry around, and so they're sort of a freelancer in a battle like this. And in the morning of, middle of the morning, late morning of July 2nd, some signalmen were up here, and they looked out across the way, and you can see, hard to point out exactly any one of those laser pointers from the cyclorama. You can see straight through the trees what looks like a couple of white-roofed barns. And that is what we call the Plank Farm, owned by the Plank family. And there is a small hill, not small, it's a pretty substantial hill right there, which is where Longstreet turned around on his famous countermarch. Now when he did at 12:30 in the afternoon, around noontime, the signalman here sent a signal up to Meade's headquarters, not far from where looks like a billboard, but it's the Cyclorama building, past the Pennsylvania Cathedral. And they sent a signal saying, warn General Howard, the Confederates are moving from our left to our right with ambulances trailing, meaning heading for battle. You didn't take the ambulances unless you were going to need them. And so what the signalman saw was after Longstreet had turned around. Now it's a good bet they would have seen him if he had kept going and the signal would have been different. They simply waited to get all the news. But from here you can get a sense of where Longstreet was and how close it was. And then he turned around, and several hours later, 4:30, there was a signal from the woods by the Alabama Monument across there. The signalman looked out, saw the Confederates march across the area where the Eisenhower farm is, saw the Confederates go behind a ridge, and said, the Confederates are massing west of town, da-da-da-da-da. Now, according to that, well, it's difficult to say from there. That's where we get to multiple choice. But one good theory is that Meade said to Warren, go down there and see what's happening. There's a movement going on. Go down, see what's happening, tell me what's going on. I'm going to ride out and see what this idiot Sickles is doing. Meade rode out that way, and Warren came down this way, and then they met a little later as they were both returning to the headquarters. They ran into each other up near the Weicker. Warren at that time was bleeding quite badly, and set of events sort of got set in motion at that point. So Warren came to the top of the hill, and here's where multiple choice sets in. Choice A is Warren's story, which he wrote in a private letter to a fellow from the 140th New York, we'll talk about in a few minutes, when Porter Farley was asking Warren the order of march for his brigade that he couldn't quite figure out. And in the course of the letter, Warren told very briefly his story of here. I came to the top of the hill, and I posed just like this monument. And this monument replicates the Warren version of the story. He came to the top of the hill, looked out across the... Now, why is he using the binoculars here? Yeah. Looked out across the valley. Now, keep in mind, all of the trees between us and the Alabama Monument in the distance were not here at the time of the battle. And they've since grown up. They've been removed so many... I think about 30 years ago was the last time they removed them. But unless you go and plow and cut and mow, which you can't because it's full of boulders and rocks, you can't keep the trees down. The cost of cutting them down is really not much. The cost of keeping them from growing back is the complicated question. But in any event, the Confederates had gone in behind Warfield Ridge, the highest tree line that's close to us there. Now, the signalmen had seen them go in, so they sort of had an advantage. And Warren comes up and looks out across the valley with his pose here, and he looks through his binoculars, and he's making the lay of the land. And the 4th Maine anchored the left of the Union line down in Devil's Den and stretched out across House Ridge and out to the Peach Orchard. And so Warren, as in all battles, is concerned about the flank, because when you attack front on, a lot of people are going to die and you're not going to accomplish much. But if you get them on the end, in the flank, then you can really roll up a flank and accomplish a great deal more. So his concern is the flank, usually. Who's in front, that's not so important. Comes up to the top of the hill and he looks, sees something that kind of catches his eye, and according to Warren, he sends a guy on a horse down to a battery below, which, near as we can tell, would have been the 2 rear guns of Smith's battery parked down here at Limbard. And he says, fire a shot over that hill, and as the cannon fires the shot, and according to Warren, as all the Confederates in the woods there ducked because the shell went over, the sunlight glinting off their bayonets reflected in this direction, revealing to him a whole bunch of Confederates in the woods and danger approaching. And so he then set in motion a series of events that caused the fighting here to take place. Well, at least that's Warren's story. There's a few problems with it. The sun doesn't reflect in that direction. And the men in the battery never unlimbered the guns at that point, which makes it real uncomfortable for a horse if you fire one of those. And claimed they never heard anything from General Warren. And the other problem is you can see the ridge is much taller than a man, and any Confederates behind it, unless they're about 12.5 feet tall, wouldn't have been able to be seen over the top. There's all kinds of problems. There's not a large enough woodline. Men were taller back then. By the way, that reminds me of a quick aside. A friend of mine, I was explaining how the battle worked and how the short men stood in the front row and the tall men in the back row and the way the whole infantry tactics were done. And she goes, maybe that's why we're all so much taller now. The short guys all got killed first. And I got to thinking, I wonder if you can find that out. Anyway, they weren't 12 feet tall in those days. And the Confederates were in that direction, and Warren and the Confederates. Well, now there's another story. Choice B. C is obviously none of the above, which is what most of us choose. But C, choice B is the signalman story. They read, this letter was published years later, and the signalmen were furious, and in the history of their unit, they wrote their response to the story, which was this. Warren came up on the hill under Meade's orders because they had sent a signal. And they said, there's a whole bunch of Confederates out in those woods. We saw them march in there. And Warren says, well, I don't see them. Now, that makes sense because Warren's not going to give General Meade, the commander of the Army, information until he knows darn well what's in those woods. And so he's a little skeptical, which he should be. And he's looking. Now, the signalmen spent their lives looking through binoculars, and Warren only did it when it was necessary. So they're more familiar with, not like Army intelligence photographs. They're used to staring at things miles away and interpreting. I don't see them. Well, sir, they're out there. I don't see them. Well, they're out there. And at this point, according to the signalmen, a shell exploded just over our heads. Now, this also makes sort of sense because they described it as a sort of a signal shot of the first shot. And if that's the case, if you were out about where the Longstreet Tower is and somebody rode up and said, you're going to fire the signal shot in about an hour, and you're a lieutenant in charge of a section of guns and you're doing this for an hour, knowing you're going to fire a shot, you're not just going to fire a shot, you're going to go, where am I going to hit those flags from here? And you got, it's the only target presenting itself, and you got an hour to guess. So it's not at all unusual to think that that shell exploded right up here if there was a good artilleryman behind it. It wasn't all that windy a day. In any event, the shell exploded, according to the signalman. Fragment of it hit Warren right in here, across the throat or the neck. And if you ever cut yourself shaving, you know how much you bleed when you get cut down there. Well, if you get a good scrape, he was bleeding like crazy. Bent over, grabbed his neck, and the signalman at that point looked down and said, now do you see him? So that's their version of events. Now, my favorite choices are C and D, both or none of the above, because no one's ever going to really know. And it really doesn't matter, although it makes for interesting interpretation, because frankly, Warren did then set in motion the horseback riders who brought troops here, which eventually caused the Union Army to hold on to this piece of ground. So whether or not how he discovered the Confederates is really not all that relevant to the military strategy of it all, but it makes an interesting story because who do you believe? And the thing is, you can go to Shiloh or Antietam or Cold Harbor, and you won't find these kind of contradictory arguments very much, but Gettysburg seems to be this sort of fought-over important thing. There are 1,300 monuments, memorials, and markers on the battlefield. At Antietam, is 84, and that's the second most important battle. So there is something about this place that causes these fights, and to say nothing about Haskell and the 72nd Pennsylvania, or Jubal Early inventing morning at dawn attack orders to desecrate Longstreet, and not even get into that stuff, just the general quibbling. And the bottom line is the men who fought here on Little Round Top were here for a total of 3 hours, most of them. The first hour and a half, they were shot at and shot back. The second hour and a half, it was dark and they fell asleep. 25 years later, every single one of them can tell you exactly what rock they were sitting on when that happened. There's no way you can remember that kind of stuff. I fell in a creek down here once last year. It was about 10 degrees. And as an experiment, I waited 3 weeks to come back and see if I could find the rock I fell off of. And it took a while. And I wasn't being shot at. And so people's memories aren't nearly as good as they claimed they were 20 and 30 years later. And you get these sort of what people see as affronts. The signalmen thought they were being slighted, and so they answered Warren and so on and so forth. So why is Warren's statue like this and not like the signalmen? And this is important when you visit Gettysburg, because the version of events that is most heroic, because that's what we want from our heroes in our battles, is the one that's portrayed in bronze or granite or whatever. Because, frankly, do we really want a statue of Warren on Little Round Top looking like this? Because the path is over here, you remember, and that's just not a good thing to see when you come up with it. And so, what we know about the battle is the heroic and the American way of looking at things, because that's how we feel. And with the memorialization period, when they put up all the monuments, there was a lot of reconciliation and reunion, and so there's not a lot of anti-anything monuments. And there was one plan, actually. The first Minnesota monument originally was a fellow, a Union infantryman stabbing a serpent, and the serpent was secession with a bayonet. There's this big dramatic thing, he's killing this, southern serpent. And they didn't allow it because that would be just, too unkind to our southern brethren at that period of time. So that period of time was the two sides were in reunion and getting along better. So, frankly, the poor Warren, who died in '72, somewhat disgraced by things that happened in the latter part of the war, putting a monument to him, mooning the crowd as they approach the field is just not the kind you want. But this was the first statue on the battlefield, and it was put up at that time to commemorate Warren's moment here, which we've all forgotten since the movie came out, because everything happened on the other side of the hill. But so far as we know, Warren rode off and sent men off to assault troops. Vincent's brigade arrived down near what we call the Fred Flintstone Monument, because it looks like it came from bedrock, the Pennsylvania Reserve Monument there, down at the intersection of Ayers Avenue. One of those riders ran up to Vincent and said, "This hill, nobody on it, Confederates coming, da-da-da-da-da." And then Vincent came around the back of the hill, which is one of those unknown things. We know that Vincent went around the back of the hill to stay out of artillery range. We know that Warren and the 104th New York and others never saw Vincent's brigade come onto the hill. And we know that, according to Norton and others, they approached the hill, or ascended the hill, from east to west. But we don't know how they got up here. We do know, however, that at least one of Hazlitt's guns reached the top of the hill under horsepower, which is amazing when you think about it. And so there had to have been at that time, actually Porter Farley and some others talked about a trail that they all used. And he said it was just past the railroad tracks where the schoolhouse is, and that gave us some sense. But there had to have been a trail wide enough for the axles of a caisson to come up to the top of the hill. And a lot of us have spent a lot of time in the winter without leaves on the trees measuring, and there's really only one very narrow area where there aren't big boulders or steep inclines that you had to come up the hill. And it begins just past where the Boy Scout trail is, and probably came out underneath Sykes Avenue and came out over here where we'll talk about in a minute. But that was apparently the only access to the hill from behind, out of artillery range, to the top. Now there's the old hard day for mother story, which began down along the fence down there. And it's interesting because in exploring other things, we came upon a little more detail about it. This, is, of course, is the story where Chamberlain is riding with it. Chamberlain, I should explain who he is, probably. He's riding with his brother John and his brother Tom with the unit up to the top of the hill. Now, according to the accounts, Chamberlain was with the 20th, and the last man in the 20th Maine, a guy named, oh geez, I'm going to forget now. Ah, well, some guy from Maine is in the artillery. He was definitely the last guy to make it. They're in the rear of he was in the rear of the regiment, and the 16th Michigan's lead person was right behind him. So we know from about 13 accounts of this little event that the 20th Maine was directly in front of. The last guy of the 20th was right ahead of the first guy in the 16th. Now, whether the 83rd and 44th were in front or behind or both split or who knows. But in any event, the 20th was riding, Chamberlain was with the regiment, and a shell exploded very near the back of the 20th Maine. And a piece of that shell went right through the side of the head of a horse on which was riding the adjutant of the 16th Michigan. Well, horse and rider went down, blood everywhere. The guy busted his knee as the horse landed on him. And years later, he told the story in great depth, had like 13 of his buddies write pension records confirming the story. Of course, it was all different in all 13 stories, but the bottom line was that he made it to the top of the hill and kept fighting, or he was carried away, or he stayed there, or picked, again, multiple choice. But it did get busted, so he got his pension, which is the important thing. But in any event, that shell exploded. When it killed the horse, this big, blood everywhere, horse goes down, and this rider and everything, and that was what caused Chamberlain to turn around and say, boy, if that happens again, we're in big trouble, and that would make it hard for Mother. And so that event apparently happened down right about where that jogger is. It takes timing like this. You got to get people in as they headed back up the Wheatfield Road to come around the back. And so the artillery that came under fire was in that general area. But anyway, we leave Warren as he sends people off in every direction. Now, some of those people he encountered, of course, was Vincent, who came up to the hill from behind, and Warren never saw him. And as time went on, the 4th and 5th Texas probably approached what is about the Michigan Sharpshooter Monument. Now, they didn't fight here, but they got a monument, because they fought spread out in so many places that they said, where are we going to put our monument? We go, well, everybody goes to Little Round Top. Let's put it there. So we have a monument here to a unit that was really fought down there somewhere, but they said, hey, that's where everybody visits. We want them to see our monument, so it's up here. And Warren came back and looked down and saw that the 4th and 5th Texas were approaching what he thought was the unoccupied top of the hill, whereas Vincent was really over there. He hadn't seen him yet. And so in somewhat of a panic, he took off down the hill. Just as he poked his nose out of the woods where that trail that we've never really put our fingers on was, he ran into two people. Well, along the way, he ran into Hazlitt and his battery and said, get up the hill. Now, in those days, the Army had reorganized the artillery that it wasn't under the command of an infantry commander, so they could break off a battery and send it. So Hazlitt pops on his horse and tries to make his way up the hill. This very narrow path, maybe a couple inches wider than the width of a caisson axle. And they start the 6 guns up the hill. Now keep in mind, it takes 100 horses to pull a 6-gun battery. When you see those on the battlefield plop, they didn't just kind of put them on their shoulder and carry them and drop them there. It took 6 horses to pull the gun, 6 horses to pull its ammunition, all kinds. But it took 100 horses to pull a 6-gun battery. So those things don't move easily and quickly in a small space. So Hazlitt starts up this small path up the hill to reach the top. And somewhere along the way runs into boulders and rocks, and men start manhandling the guns and the caissons and so forth. As Warren reached the opening of the woods, he comes out and he sees a familiar face. He sees somebody from his original brigade that he had once commanded, Weed's Brigade as we call it now. And he saw on horseback Patty O'Rourke, first in his class at West Point. Warren had known him earlier, in charge of the 140th New York. Now Warren says to him, Patty, get up that hill. Explains the danger as quickly as he could and so forth. And O'Rourke had 2 interesting things to say. One was, but sir, our orders are to continue out this road to this place they're going to call the wheat field someday and fight out there where the 20th Maine just left. You know, you saw the movie. And so their orders are to follow the brigade out to the wheat field because that's where the rest of the brigade was headed. So he's countermanding their order. Well, being a brigadier, which is one of the advantages the North had over the South here at Gettysburg, subordinate commanders on staffs tended to be brigadier generals, not lieutenants and majors. And when brigadier generals told a colonel, move your troops, they did. When Lee's adjutant, who was either a lieutenant or captain or so forth, said move, they're like, you're just a lieutenant or a captain. So one of the advantages in subordinate command at Gettysburg was the Union folks had brigadier generals in charge of things, whereas the Confederates had majors and stuff like that. And so he's a brigadier general, used to command infantry. I know him. He'll take the responsibility, get to the top of the hill. So Patty O'Rourke then says the second thing, which is critical to this fight. But sir, we're left in front. Now, if you know anything about military tactics, you know that whenever a unit marches, there are 2 men deep facing in battle line. They turn right, and the 2 step up, as they say in reenacting. The men who are number 2 step up, so they're 4 across. And you always go to the right. Why? Because when somebody yells front, you go like this. The short guys are in front, the tall guys are in back, and the colonel's over there, and the captain's over there, and so on and so on. Officers behind. If you march left in front, which you did in an emergency because you had to get somewhere quick, then you march, everybody turns left. It's confusing because Bill's supposed to be here's over here, and Joe's supposed to be here's over here, and then when you get there and somebody else front, you all go front. Well, when you came up to the top of Little Round Top left in front, somebody else front, and you go like this. Trouble is, the enemy's back there. And you can't just do one of these, because then the short guys are in the back row, and that's not good if you're a tall guy. Of course, that puts the colonel and the captain and the major out there. So, left in front was not something soldiers liked to do, but when the 5th Corps was summoned over to this part of the field by Meade because of the events that were transpiring, some of them were in such a hurry and had heard the danger was so important, just go. So they marched left in front all the way from the other side of the battlefield, which was not unusual. The trouble was you had to be really careful when you got to the front. The only way to fix left in front, if it was backwards, was that you got to where you were, everybody stayed in column before, and then you counter-marched until your left was facing the opposite way. Then you yelled front, and everybody was facing the enemy instead of the trees. In any event, suffice to say that 140th New York marched up the hill backward. And I don't mean they did one of these. And I don't mean to say anything bad about New Yorkers. I just mean that they marched left in front, which is very confusing when you enter action or meet action left in front, because you're backwards, and Bill's supposed to be here, and Joe's supposed to be here. And it's very critical to Civil War soldiers to know who that guy is, where the captain is, and that's how you were trained over and over and over again to fight. And when Joe was back there, when he was supposed to be there, and he's shorter than I am, and it just throws off all of your military ability. And it takes a good 5 minutes to reorganize. You got to count off, turn around, and all that kind of stuff. So the 140th starts up the hill backwards, totally contrary to their orders. And after a few steps, they run into the horses and guns of Hazlitt's battery. Well, on a small muddy trail, keep in mind that it rained every day for 2 weeks right up until July 2nd. July 2nd is the only day it didn't rain for 3 weeks around the time of the battle. So it's muddy, there's a narrow path, a lot of horses have been standing there for a while, which leaves behind some unpleasant problems. You're wearing old army shoes and you're marching backwards. And then you run into caissons and limbers, and artillerymen and infantrymen, as you know, liked each other very much. So by the time the 140th reached the top of the hill, they were nothing but a mob. Because left in front, and the caissons and limbers, and then the backwards, and the officers are grabbing, hey, give a hug. And so this mass of people with 6 guns mingled among it keep heading for the top of the hill. So you can imagine when they get to the top of the hill, they're not going to be much use for a while. And that's how everyone started to arrive. That's how battles happen. A bunch of guys stand off nice and orderly, and then everything falls apart. And that's typical of a Civil War battle. And those who are trained to fight regardless, whether this is Bill or Joe or Pete or Steve, they just line up and fight, are the ones who usually succeed. And so we'll go up to Hazlitt's battery in just a second. But that's more or less how everyone reached the hill. Vincent in a somewhat orderly manner, and then the rest sort of not so orderly. Eventually, Weed, who was all the way out, it's a very long, complicated story about how somebody went out and said, Weed said, can I go to that hill? And Sickles said, no, I need you. And then they said, well, one of my units is already there, and then back and forth. But eventually, the rest of Weed's brigade with the 140th came up to the top of the hill at the very end of the fighting, as the last few shots are being traded among the Vince's brigade and the Alabamans and Texans who assaulted. Weed's brigade came up, and that's what these monuments are along in here, Weed's brigade. And eventually, as many of you know, Crawford charged into the already retreating Confederates in the valley below. As many of you may not know, Crawford came very late, just about at dusk, and the Confederate assault had sort of fizzled itself out. They had run out of energy and steam, reached the creek, most of them, and stopped. Darkness was coming on. So they turned around and backed up to the tree line on either side of the wheat field. Now, McLaws' men, as they were backing up, were harassed a bit by Crawford as he charged bravely across the wheat field. Now, Scott Hartwig, a park historian, has a great story about that. Of course, there's a famous painting of Crawford riding with a flag and the horse and everything else. And Scott says Crawford was a very big blowhard after the war and tended to make up lots of interesting stories. Owned Devil's Den in the valley so that he could commemorate himself, sold it so they could put a trolley across it. He was a strange guy. But Scott has said frequently, the only way that charge ever happened is if the sergeant gave him the flag and stabbed the horse in the rear end with a sword. But you can imagine the real story, which is that Crawford tried to grab the flag to lead his men into the retreating Confederates. What the heck, they're retreating, we might as well jump in among them. And the sergeant wouldn't give it up, like a good color sergeant wouldn't let go. So you can, eventually, he said, I'm your general, don't you know me, give me the flag, blah, 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 this is my moment in history, and blah, blah. Dale Gallen's going to paint me someday, give me that flag. So he gets the flag away, and so the sergeant lets go and says, all right, but he grabs his leg. So you can imagine this picture, which isn't in the painting, of Crawford going across the field like, But again, do we really want a painting of a sergeant holding on to the devil's leg? Shut up, No, we don't want that. So we paint the story of Crawford bravely leading his men. Now, years later, he met McLaws, and they were talking about something. He told him, it's worth the commission in the Army to me if you will exaggerate the resistance your men put up as I charged into them. So he's all but bribing McLaws to make up a story about how, because if you ever saying you charged into retreating guys, they were done anyway. Crawford wanted to get the other general to, so that's the goofy story. But that's how the history of the battle gets written. These men bribing each other and trying to, the sergeant wasn't really hanging on and so on. Which says nothing about Webb wrestling with a color sergeant in the middle of Pickett's charge, which is a whole other story. But these are, we don't want a picture of Crawford on a horse with a sergeant hanging on his leg. We want Crawford standing there with a flag and so on and so forth. So there are lots of interesting stories. By the way, there's one other story that has always fascinated me, and I don't think we understand a lot of times the chaos and what it can, of battle and what it can do to your mind. And Smith's guns Smith has a story which I think is very telling, and it's important to remember these kinds of things, because people talk about the one musket somebody picked up on the battlefield after the battle, which had 22 rounds shoved down the barrel. But you think, that's impossible, you can't even fit them in there. And you think, what idiot would do that? And you can't understand the chaos and the fear and so forth, and adrenaline of battle. But Smith has a very telling account. He finally got on his horse when they abandoned the guns, and he takes off through the valley. The same valley, of course, that General Hunt almost got stampeded over when the cattle came running from George Wyckoff's farm to across the valley. And as he rode back across the valley, past the two rear guns, and everyone skedaddled, he remembered not somewhere down in here, he got shot in the leg. I think it was the right leg. Then his boot starts to fill up with blood, and he said it was excruciating pain. And he's riding along with a teamster who had grabbed the horse and was leaving with him. And they get to the area down off in the woods over here, and they pull over. He said the pain was, he thought he was dead or was going to lose his leg, and the pain was excruciating. He couldn't stand it, climbed down off his horse, but then realized he hadn't been shot at all. The horse had. And the blood from the horse was filling up his boot. Now here's a man so certain that he had been shot, he was in excruciating pain. And I remember he wrote this himself in a history that he wrote. I think, if I remember right, when he looked at the sergeant, he was like, don't you dare tell anybody. But then he wrote about it himself and said, you know, in the course of battle, and I think that's a really important story, because in the course of battle, even captains who are not right on the firing line, but who are supposed to be cool-headed and observing and so forth, when they're riding away, he swore he was in excruciating pain from a wound he didn't have. And so for a private to shove 22 rounds down the barrel is not, we think of it very orderly, because we think of it in terms of maps and lines, and we know where the monuments are. But battle was very, very confusing. But everybody knew 25 years later exactly where they were sitting and exactly what they said. So the battle history is quite interesting. We'll walk up now, and Bug Dean, who's up there holding forth up at the cannons, and we'll talk about Hazlitt's guns and then move over to the rest of the part of the hill. Mr. Weed's brigade did very little during the fight, suffered a handful of casualties, fired at a distance and so forth. Yet the 91st had originally a different monument on that site, which is this one. It used to have a cannonball on top with that, a granite cannonball with that sort of spike comes out. But it's a very long story, too long to explain today, but Virginia and North Carolina fought until yesterday, and they're still fighting, over whose fault losing the battle was. I always like Pickett's account. Let's say, who do you think, was it North Carolina or Virginia that lost Pickett's charge? And he said, I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it, which I think is appropriate. But New York and Pennsylvania had a great deal of quibbling over who was responsible for the Union victory. Now, this is a battlefield in Pennsylvania, but more New Yorkers fought here, and back and forth and back and forth. And so one would build a big monument, the other one would build one bigger, and the other one would build a big monument, the other one would build one big. So there was this ongoing sort of battle between Pennsylvania and New York for credit for winning the battle. And the 91st Pennsylvania placed this monument out there, and then the 44th New York, we'll get to in a few minutes, built this one. So they said, oh, we're going to build one that's as big as that. So the 91st built this one. And then they moved the second one. What are we going to do with this old one? Well, we'll stick it back here somewhere. So now this regiment that hardly fired a shot really has two monuments on the battlefield. One to compete with the castle, and so it goes on and on and on. But this one now is placed on the site where Hazlitt and Weed were both mortally wounded or killed during the course of the battle, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's still engraved on the back behind this monument. This is the spot where they fell, and so forth. But as far as Hazlitt's guns, there are several reasons why we know they weren't right here. And primarily it has to do with the function of artillery. Artillery, when it fired with a round in it, unlike in the movie, the round caused a great deal of rearward force on the tube, because the shell held all the force in until it got outside of the tube. And so artillery, unlike in reenacting, cracked when it fired because the shell held the sound until the last second. And when it did, it kicked back on average 6 to 9 feet, depending on a lot of different variables. And if that were the case, there'd be a tour bus or a couple of Saturns behind us that would be in a great deal of danger. And so we know that this is not where Hazlitt's guns were placed on the second day, because they would have flown down the hill the first time they fired them. They were actually placed over by the 44th New York monument. The trouble was, when they came to place the guns officially, they had two problems. One, do they place the second or the third day? And that's one of the complicated things about having a 3-day battle, is which day does this mean? In Culp's Hill, you see monuments behind one another. It looks like the Union guys are shooting into the backs of their own guys, but it's just different days. So they ended up placing them here because there was a road down there, and you couldn't put cannons in the middle of the road, so this is the only other flat spot they could do. And this has been built up a little bit in front of us here. So the guns aren't in the right place, and they weren't shooting at the Eisenhower farm, but this is the only place to put them for interpretive reasons at the time. So monuments tend to also be in places that are more practical than really the interpretation part. The other thing about not putting Hazlitt's guns here on the second day is that they're of no use here. Eisenhower's farm was not a hub of activity during the fight for Little Round Top. Another problem about this is this, and this is something that Hazlitt realized as soon as he arrived on the hill. He got here and saw 2 guns, said, leave the other ones, there's no room. And somebody said to him, well, you might as well take those 2 down too, because you can't fire at the Confederates, who the 4th and 5th Texas by now are just below us. Why can't you? Well, you can't fire artillery downhill, which causes a problem for our friend when the exploding wall down on the sharpshooter in Devil's Den. Artillery cannot fire downhill. It can't fire much more flat than this, because the tube is what takes all of the force back here, if you know anything about engineering or physics. If you tilt the tube downward, the force goes this way, which means the cannon is going to do a somersault. And if you're one of the gunners, that's an uncomfortable situation to be in. And in fact, there is a story at Antietam of a couple of guys who raised up the tail to fire at some Confederates downhill, and they fired at it. Because when you leave the force against the carriage, you're fairly safe. When you tilt the tube and it goes against just the tube, the tail becomes a fulcrum, and the whole thing just goes flying that way. So you cannot fire artillery downhill. The best you could do here is maybe that White House on the Emmitsburg Road. You cannot go any lower than that, because if you do, you'll wish you hadn't. And so from over there, the best they could do is fire noise. Fire at Confederates where they had been, and that's not going to do you much good. Fire at their knapsacks, which isn't going to do you much good. We'll destroy their rations, by God. So Hazlitt said, but wait a minute, the best, even though I can't hit any of those Texans, of course you didn't know they were Texans at the time, the least I can do is scare the Jewillikers out of them, because the sound of artillery from in front of it is not very attractive to an infantryman charging. So for all we know, Hazlitt may have fired blanks. Nobody knows for sure, but we'll talk about in a minute that it did have some effect. He put 2 guns up here and kaboom, kaboom, because it gives the Union guys a great deal of enthusiasm and good morale to know you've got big guns behind you, and it takes the wind out of the Texans' legs to know if you get past the infantry, then you get artillery to charge into, and that just sort of takes all the fun out of a good charge. So Hazlitt fired something, and it made a lot of noise, and it did have an important effect we'll talk about in a minute, but he didn't fire anything that had inflicted any damage down here, because you can't. Now on the 3rd day, 2 guns, I believe, got into action against Pickett's charge, but as you can see from up here, being able to find the range and the smoke and hit anything of any consequence is minimal. And so really not much of anything occurred against Pickett's charge, but everybody in Pickett's charge later talked about all those cannons all around top that bombarded us. Because as they read books and accounts of the battle, they heard about the artillery on Little Round Top, and they assumed we must have been bombarded from that famous place, because it ties them into another famous part of the battle. When in fact the artillery that hit them, most of it came from along the Gilbreys line up by the Pennsylvania monument. But again, the legends and lore build, and then everybody, you know, to hear the Confederates tell it in Pickett's charge, there had to be 700 cannon up here, because they all got shot at by it. But it's just as they read the accounts and the stories, that must have been where that shell came from. Nobody ever sees a shell hit and go, wait, there's a smoke trail, wait, Little Round Top, that's where it came from. You got other things on your mind at the time. One guy in, like, the left end of Pettigrew's line said he got hit from Little Round Top, and unless they had, like, 100-pound Parrott rifles or something. Now, these are 10-pound Parrots. This band here keeps it from exploding, and these are rifled guns. The black ones are rifled. They fire long distances, smaller shots. The green ones are brass guns, which are smoothbore, fire bigger rounds a shorter distance. And so I could get lucky and hit the cyclorama from here. I could do some serious damage to the Pennsylvania monument with a rifle gun. But it's the difference, if you're a hunter, between a shotgun and a rifle. The smoothbores are the kind you want in close quarters. These are the kind you want to shoot at a long distance. So these are 10-pound Parrott rifles. There were some 20-pound Parrott rifles here at the battle. In fact, some of them shooting at Little Round Top. But that's about as big as you could get on a carriage and tow it and make it operate correctly. One of the other interesting things about artillery is there were 2 Whitworth guns. Those are screw-breeched, rear-loading artillery pieces. You unscrew the breech, shove a shell in, screw it back in rather than load from the front. And they fired about a really neat shot about 5 miles. But there's a very important problem with artillery firing 5 miles, is you don't know where it hit. Where'd it go? I don't know, that way. So in those days you didn't have forward observers and radio operators and everything else. You didn't know where it hit. And if you didn't know where the last shell hit, you didn't know how to adjust for the next one. Because artillery is very simple. Boom, that's where it hit, 2 degrees left. And they move the tail a couple inches, a little bit long, and you change the screw and you fire again. And about the 4th or 5th shot, you got the range, as they said, and then you just boom, ba-da-boom, ba-da-boom, ba-da-boom on that spot. Well, if you don't know where it hit, it's useless. And so these wonderful Whitworths could fire 5 miles for a very little use because I don't know what they're hitting. Could have hit General Lee for all we know. For God's sake, stop shooting that gun. So artillery was a very tricky thing. In fact, there's one account of a guy in the peach orchard. He fired a shot and then flat right on his belly on the ground. And the general rode up thinking he was a coward and started screaming at him. I think it was Humphreys who rode up. And what he didn't realize is that he was hitting the ground to be able to see under the smoke, to see where the shell hit, so he'd know how to adjust for the next shot. And when the general realized that, oh, okay, he rode up. There's a lot of these accounts. In Pickett's charge, of course, the artillery bombardment largely failed because they didn't know where the shells were hitting to adjust. So they bombarded the Jewillikers out of the Taneytown Road, which is not an important military fortification for the Union, and didn't do any damage to the Union guns, or enough damage, because you have to see where the shell hits to aim the next one. And that was a part of the problem for Hazlitt. You have to be able to aim downhill, and you can't. Trust me, it goes over upside down. There's a great account about Antietam when that happened. So Hazlitt made it to the top of the hill with 2 guns where we're headed. And remember, some other folks are still behind us, and remember that Weed and Hazlitt were killed here, and I'll explain more about that from down there, and you'll understand better when we get down there. So let's get down to that big castle down there and talk about it. If it falls on a weekend, we usually have a picnic. One thing I forgot to mention, which you can still get a perspective of, one of the great myths of the Battle of Gettysburg is if the Confederates had managed to take this hill, they could have, quote, unquote, God, I don't know how many times I've heard this exact sentence, bombarded the Union Army into submission. Destroyed the Union Army. Now, first of all, I don't know of a time in history when an army of 100,000, 80, 90,000 people was ever destroyed in a day. And that's one of the things we get a little carried away about. Armies that big just don't cease to exist in a couple hours. They fall apart, go somewhere, reform, and come back. But in any event, there's one big problem with Little Round Top as that end. Meade said it, and Longstreet said it. Everybody said, oh, this was over there. This was the key. If they had gotten artillery up here. None of those people ever took a very simple, and Meade was an engineer too, took a very simple experiment. Well, to bombard the Union Army into submission, I would have put a gun here, and a gun here, and a and a gun. Because if you notice, Little Round Top is not round. It's hot dog shaped. All beef, mostly beef wiener dog. It's shaped like a long, narrow hill in that direction. All Hazlitt could do against the Confederates on the second day was get 2, maybe 4 guns on the top of the hill. He sent the rest down, he won't fit. And that's in that direction. If you take Hazlitt's guns and you turn them toward the Union line, the guys in the next cannon are going to be really upset if you fire that gun. You can't fire artillery in that direction. The hill doesn't provide a 15-foot platform, which is what you need, a square, flat 15-foot area to fire a gun. So this whole concept of bombing the Union Army into submission is impossible, unless you can do it with 2 guns. And they'd have to be really big guns. So I brought an artillery friend, an expert up, and we walked around for a long time trying to give the best case scenario for the Confederates, saying, all right, assuming everything was in their favor, assuming somebody could notice it, find a battery, give the order that they had taken the Wheatfield Road so they could run the caissons. I mean, there's a whole lot of what-ifs, not to mention the 15,000 men of the 6th Corps just a couple hundred yards away waiting to retake the hill. But anyway. So you put the guns on the top of the hill, and we looked and saw those, where would there have been platforms. And we even gave them entrenching tools and to build platforms in the night. We tried everything to give them the benefit of the doubt. The best we could do is 8 guns, and even then it required 3 levels. And as most of you may remember, the Confederates seldom fired over themselves because their fuses were unreliable. And if you fire and the fuse jump fires, as they called it, in other words, a fuse lit too far forward, it would blow up just outside the gun. So they almost never did that. But if they had, they got 8 guns on the hill. I said, all right, could 8 guns have bombarded the Union Army into submission? And he just kind of grinned and he said, how many guns did they have on the 3rd day against Pickett's charge? And I said, about 140. 148. Did they even make a hole in the line? No. You think 8 guns could have bombarded the Union Army into submission? I guess not. But along the way, Meade said things like, had I lost that hill, I would have removed or left the battlefield. Now, he forgot to mention, or nobody recorded, I would have tried to take it back first. Yeah. And with that line of McGilvery's artillery, they could have made rubble out of this place. and the 15,000 men of the 6th Corps looking for something to do over by the chuck wagon having an ice cream. There's no way the Confederates would have held this hill for more than 10 minutes, especially without water, as Oates claimed and so forth. But in any event, it becomes, because of offhand comments that Longstreet and others made about the importance about giving credit to some veteran standing next to him, which doesn't get recorded in the account, you know. They talked about the importance of the hill, and it became bigger and better and more, like everything else at Gettysburg. But this is the area where we bring O'Rourke's men into the fight. And that trail, by best guess, because there isn't enough room for a caisson anywhere else, probably came out right about here. And the road used to come out right about here and then go back out that path and came out again at Warren and back out way back in the 1890s, and they've since adjusted it. So Hazlitt's guns were in the only flat space big enough for 2 cannons to fire in this general area. And there is a sketch of that with these rocks in it. No, mind him, it's not. That's that Don Troiani picture of Vincent up here. I'm like, Don, you got it wrong. And of course, that just sets Don off. What do you mean I got it wrong? And they said, where's the monument? He's like, oh, shut up. So, but anyway, they had to have been right about here. And of course, the other thing you keep in mind is, why would you have guns there? The Confederates were over there. So they were here pointed in that direction, and you can't fire downhill. Somebody said that to Hazlitt. He goes, yeah, but the noise. The noise will boost the confidence of our men, scare the Texans. By now, the Texans are just beyond the honeysuckle here. In fact, that new painting Don did last year, those 3 rocks are the ones that he painted the Texans reaching. And they're coming up the hill. And so, poor Paddy O'Rourke, never been in combat yet, in charge of a regiment, big regiment, 500 and some people from New York, first experience in battle, and you know guys from West Point are always waiting for that moment to see what they're made of. And out of the woods he comes, in front of his men. Well, they were left in front, but we'll deal with that. And he comes out of the woods and somewhere over here, and the first thing he sees, probably, is, holy God, what a place to fight a battle. You can see everything from up here. And even men from West Point understood the importance of military intelligence. Having a high point free of trees that you can see most of the battlefield is very critical to decision making. And very important to a general who's only been in command 3 days. To know that you have information in 2 minutes, everything you can see can be reported to headquarters by signal flag. That had to have been wonderful for me. Nothing's going to happen over there that I don't find out about, and sure enough it didn't. So that had to have been of great value to him, and O'Rourke must have understood the importance of being able to see from up here. And high ground and fortified high ground must have been wonderful to see. Oh boy, so far so good. Takes a couple more steps. Uh-oh. The guys in blue coats are running this way at him. Well, let me do it this way at him. He didn't know it then, but there were men of the 16th Michigan who by that time were being overwhelmed by maybe 600 men from Texas who had found the flank by accident and were rolling up the 16th Michigan. Uh-oh, that's not good. So O'Rourke takes a couple of more steps and understands why they're fleeing when he looks down and sees a wall of gray Texans coming up the hill. Oh, geez. Now, at that point, it's hard to say exactly what went through Paddy O'Rourke's mind, but I bet one of them was, I knew I should have loaded. Because besides being left in front, nobody had a bullet in their rifle yet. Because they were just being hustled to the point. And then you get ready, and you load, and you prepare, and then you go into battle. Well, they didn't have time for any of this. Oh, geez, we're left in front. Oh, geez, we got no bullets. Oh, geez. He wasn't from Wisconsin, but he was, oh, geez. So anyway, out of the woods they come, and here's Paddy. The big moment of his life. Lead my men bravely into battle, and they're backwards, and they're not loaded, and oh, geez. What a bust. So he did the best he could, which was to pull out his sword in front of his men and say, this way, boys, or down here, boys. And somewhere, not far from where we are, he started forward. Took a bullet in the throat and was killed almost instantly. Now keep in mind, let me stop and have a little aside here about the fame of Little Round Top. We've now lost Weed, a brigade commander, Hazlitt, the battery commander, and O'Rourke, the infantry commander, and we haven't even really fired a shot yet. We're not into the fighting. And so the importance of the hill had a lot to do with how many important people died there. Everybody who commanded something, with a few exceptions, got killed here. Even Warren got wounded. And so we haven't even gotten to the serious fighting, and we've lost all these important people. And important people in the records and remembrances and stories become, boy, that must have been a really important place. But O'Rourke, all here, shot through the throat and dies. His whole, all that training in 30 seconds of combat, which is kind of sad. Right behind him, 500 New Yorkers come marching out of the woods, backwards, left and front, no cannon. Horse, dookie on their feet. Uh-oh. And what's interesting about that is they came out of the woods, not in column of fours, which is how infantry march, but in mob of 200 or something like that. And 500 of them came plowing out of the woods in no particular order. You can imagine the poor captains. Just left, right, just go. And into this mess. Now that's important because it may have contributed to their victory. About an equal number of Texans are coming over the hill, pushing the 16th Michigan aside. And they look up, and just as Hazlitt starts kaboom, kaboom, which takes a whole lot out of your legs, come what looks like 3 or 4 regiments across coming out of the woods. Looks like a brigade because they're not 4 across, they're a mob across. And as you look up and see that, you'd think it's a whole brigade coming. One of the Texans down in the valley later on said it probably was about Crawford's charge, but it points out something. He said, and he was up here with veterans years later, and he said, they were talking about the fight, and he says, yeah, I was down there with my brigade, and I heard the Yankee commander giving commands. And he described the scene by saying, the command was, universe, attention, by kingdoms in the line, nations on the right. His point was, every dadgum guy in blue in the universe was here on this hill. And part of that may be, to him, it seemed like the whole world was descending on him. And which also points out why the Confederates were not likely to have taken the hill, because every Union guy in the world was headed this way by the time he got wind of it and sent troops here. But one of the things is to look up as a Texan and see all of these New Yorkers. And, you know, people from Texas don't like New Yorkers anyway, have this fear of them. They probably figure they're thugs or something. Come plowing out of the woods, look like 20 across, you figure, oh my God, the whole world's arriving. It also gives you that sense of the nick of time that the Texans felt later, if we had only been a few minutes earlier and something. But anyway, by force of body weight, with unloaded rifles, the Texans plowed into the, the New Yorkers plowed into the Texans and forced them back down the hill a short ways. And by this time, one of the descriptions by the Texans, they had come this close to a fairly orderly assault on the hill until they got run into by the Texans. And one of the Texans down there wrote a great account of the whole thing, said, privates and generals were all giving orders and no one was listening to any of them. Because by then, everybody above the rank of, captain was shot or wounded or taken from the field. And the 4th and 5th Texas had done one of these, and no one knew where and it was all apart by then. And just about the time somebody along the way might have mounted at some kind of assault, Hazlitt opened up with his blanks or gun or whatever he was firing. And the Texans were like, well, that was that. That's the end of the day for us. And they never did come back up the hill again. So in the old-fashioned John Wayne Hollywood-style nick of time, Patty O'Rourke saved this flank of Vincent's line from caving in. And Hazlitt probably did have a profound effect on the willingness of the Texans to try again against the New Yorkers with the rifles upside down like this rather than like this. And as I mentioned, Weed and Hazlitt are down, now O'Rourke is down, which moves over to Vincent. At about the same time that the 16th collapsed, because they were 2 or 3 times outnumbered by the Texans who had flanked them, somewhere below us, Vincent runs over, hops down off some pile of rocks somewhere, and tries to stop the 16th from caving in. When he did, he was shot through the hip. Died several days later of a mortal wound. Now here's where we get back to our multiple choice battlefield again. If you like engravings better than monuments, just over here on the rock there is an engraving saying this is where Colonel Vincent, commanding the brigade, was mortally wounded during the battle. Fell here during the Battle of Gettysburg. If you don't like that one, just over the hill, we'll stop in a few minutes, is a monument which says this is where Colonel Vincent was mortally wounded and fell during the course of battle. So you get your choice, A or B. C, none of the above, is probably the better choice. So nobody knows where Vincent fell. What really happened was, on that rock, it was moss covered back then, before this thing was built. And it's a long story, but the 147th New York on the first day fought near the railroad cut, but actually fought near Hall's battery out on the first ridge and was driven back to the second ridge where all the monuments are on Reynolds Avenue. There was quite a controversy between them and Batchelder. They wanted the monument where they fought. Batchelder wanted it where the road was going to be, for practical reasons. And they were very angry they couldn't put their monument where it belonged. So one of them came one day, not long after it might have even been the dedication for the Vincent monument down below, the first monument placed on the battlefield. And they came up here and they were watching the sunset standing on the rock. Boy, isn't that beautiful. And the guy kind of went like, what's this thing? And they took the moss off the rock and it says, here's where Vincent fell. Well, now this guy's furious. He says, how come we had to move our monument off the ridge where we fought to some ridge where we didn't fight, and these guys get 2? And so he wrote a letter to Vanderslice saying, so Vanderslice writes to the committee that placed the 83rd Pennsylvania, who placed the Vincent marker, including our friend Oliver Norton, we'll talk about in a little while, says, well, what's the deal? So they said, what engraving? So somebody comes from here and was like, oh, what's that? Okay, well, he was near that area when he fell. Well, it was his headquarters when he fell. So he had these men, this is exactly where we're standing that go to. Well, it was around here. And we know that as he went down, said, oh, those men in Devil's Den have been trying to get me all day, and they finally got me. He didn't know what Devil's Den was called. There are these accounts they get, so, must have been that sharpshooter guy in Devil's Den who took him back. When in fact, everybody has his legs have been crushed by that. Right? Anyway, what most likely happened to Weed and Hazlitt and O'Rourke for a long period of time after the fight, among all these rocks and trees, were Texans waiting for dark to retreat. And nothing else to do. You see a guy with a fancy hat, and so most of these guys killed from Devil's Den were much more likely killed from just down below us, because those Texans with nothing better to do said, there's an officer guy. Got him! They will! You got the other one! So these people were more practically, if you look at it reasonably, killed from up here. But it's more romantic to have them killed from Devil's Den, especially because of the photograph that said it was a sharpshooter and so on. And that gun that may or may not have been found down there with a scope on it and all that kind of stuff. But given the nature of things, a whole lot better targets down there than there are up here for a fellow in Devil's Den. There's a whole regiment of New Jerseyans and New Yorkers who are really from Massachusetts, but that's another story. Marching around down in the valley to shoot at. Why would you pick off a guy up here and stop fighting? But anyway. Along comes the 44th New York Monument, which is also the 12th New York Monument, because, like the 20th Man in the movie, some guys in the 12th New York were incorporated into 3 companies into the 44th. So our friend Dan Butterfield, the bugle call writer, had this monument built, which is interesting. It's 44 feet tall and 12 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet in the interior for the 2 regiments. What's interesting about it is on the front there's a plaque that says, down below where the flank markers are is where we fought, 100 feet below, I think it says. You go down there, you won't find them, trust me. So why aren't there flank markers? Well, here's the theory. Well, they said they ran out of money. Come on. The state of New York was broke, couldn't buy 2 $5 flank markers. Here's the theory, which is as good as any other. The first monument up here was the Michigan sharpshooter one, even though they didn't really fight here, but that's a whole other story. The second monument up was, then the second one, of course, was the 16th Michigan, which wasn't originally there. It was originally over there and turned around the other way. So the 16th Michigan came years later, and nobody visited the hill from the bottom anymore. The road was in right here. This is where they came to look. Well, we're going to have it where they can see it. Bushes had grown up around it. So a bunch of them picked it up, moved it to that rock, turned it around where you could see it better, which I'm sure caused some other veteran of Vincent Brigade to say, about time it was facing the way it was during the battle. Veterans love that kind of stuff. The veterans love that area. Anyway, it's not where it belongs because you couldn't see it from there. So they didn't care about we won the battle. We don't have to be facing the enemy. You just have to be facing the tourists. And so they moved it. But here's the thing. The 16th put its monuments in. The next one in line that put them up were the 83rd with their flank markers, leaving a fairly small piece of ground where the 44th New York would have defended. An embarrassingly small piece of ground, unless you're the 72nd Pennsylvania, and then about 10 feet is okay, because they're not going to be at the wall. And you never overlapped the enemy, the next regiment either way. That was sort of disgracing them. But nobody wanted to only have this much battle line. So one theory is they said, to hell with it. Because the 16th Michigan probably could have moved over some to compensate, to give the sharpshooters some room, being Michigan brethren. And so they kind of nudged over this way a bit and put their... Because why would they not use that part of the hill? The flank marker open. And then the 83rd squeezed the 44th out. By the time the 44th would have placed markers, there was no room. Now, nobody knows that any of that actually happened, but it makes sense in the practical sense of it all. And it has, again, more to do with what the veterans were trying to portray than it really does who was where, because nobody knows who was where exactly. They were everywhere. And so there are no flank markers, and people have looked to no end. Now, there are... Let me give you my little somebody please help me thing. There are 3 pins in the ground. When I say pins, I mean like this big around. And they're stuck in several rocks. I can never find them when I want them. I can always find them when I trip over them. But anyway, they stick up. Does anybody know what they're for? Now, if you really know, don't tell me right away.
The old tower?
These big steel pins, to build scaffolding to hold up the monument while they were building it. Which I've always thought was interesting because there had to have been big scaffolding here, and there's no picture that anyone's ever found of the monument enshrouded in whatever they had for scaffolding in the 1880s. And it'd be really interesting to see that. One of the reasons we have so little photographs of the battlefield during its prime time, right before a monument was built, during and after, is because the fellow who took all of them, Tipton, had a warehouse in town, and all of his plates were in there. I think it was 89 or 1890 that it burned, and all the plates went with it. All hundreds, thousands of photographs taken from the 1870s to about 1890. All the monument dedications, all the visitors, the battlefield, all burned. And all we have are 5,000 of his photos taken after, I think it's 1890 or 91, which are wonderful, but it was after all this happened. And occasionally you can find one. In my book, there's 2 or 3 from Ellis Spear. You would just knock on his door and say, will you come take our picture? It was a tourist thing. And he'd take a picture and mail you a photo, or you could buy it. He'd give you a copy of a Brady or something. And in private collections of people, you'll find the 20th Maine Battle Flag in my book and the one of the veterans dedicating the rock. There's millions of those pictures out there, but if you bought one from Tipton and took it home and it's still in somebody's attic, you can find an old Tipton. But the originals, can you imagine the history we could understand if we had 2,000 or 3,000 Tiptons from the 1880s, but we don't, because they burned. But anyway, we don't have a picture that's being built, which is fascinating me to know. And now we did find a couple of years ago down behind the parking lot a 100-foot long piece of cable about that big around. And it's just laying along, coincidentally enough, laying along that little path we figure must have been the path that everyone used to get here. And the only thing we can think of, is still there, but the only thing we can think of is that it was used to bring rock up to put the monument together. They had a sort of a cable system or something. I know because I tripped over it and bumped my knees when I fell down the hill. There's also over there this old-fashioned concrete platform like this, about 6 feet wide and 3 feet wide. And we can't figure out what the heck that's doing there in front of the parking lot. The nearest thing we can guess is that it was a blasting shed, and they needed a concrete floor to keep it from getting wet. But there's just in the middle of nowhere this concrete platform built probably in the 1880s sitting there. And we're like, what's that for? We can't figure it out. One of the things we guessed about a blasting shed is they did a whole lot of blasting. There are people who say, oh, they were very careful with the battlefield. In the 1890s, they bought a rock crusher. A year later, they had to replace it. They'd worn it out so bad. But there was a road, as I said, came right about where the path is here. And in order to build the roads, the roads were 28 inches of crushed rock. Big rocks on the bottom, smaller at the top, called the Telford process. And the water drained into the road and out into gullies, right through the rocks, through the road, rather than around them. Which caused problems later when they invented pavement or asphalt or macadam, because they sealed the top of the road, but that's how the water was supposed to get out. And so they had difficulty with gully washing and stuff like that. But the road came here, and as they were building it, they would blast this rock or that rock and crush it and use it for the road. They didn't care who died on it or who was next to it. These are, old freed slaves or, laborers from town that they put to work, and they battled happily. They'd blow stuff up. Well, they'd blow up a lot of stuff to make room for the road. And one day they were blasting over here, and a big chunk of rock came flying out of the ground where the road was going to be and took a piece of the 44th New York Monument off. Uh-oh. And so right about where Dean is, or right near him, along the little pointed lip that runs around it here, you'll see one of the stones has what looks like totally new mortar around it. And the stone is a slightly different color than the other stones, and that's the one they blasted out of the monument back in the day. So they haven't been as gentle and careful with the battlefield as we are today. As you can imagine, they had to go to see Emmer Cope, who was a very strict and exacting engineer who coordinated all these projects. They blew up a monument today. But there are instances we know of where boulders are just gone. And they were blasted, and I'll show you one later, blasted and used for roadbed, because why go to Tawnytown when there's a rock right here? And when veterans are still alive, it didn't occur to them to save it. D-Day veterans are just now realizing, we ought to save some of that stuff. Because why do you need to save it when you can just ask Joe what happened here? He was here. And it took years later for people to realize, we ought to take better care of this stuff. And so at the time, they weren't quite as careful. But as we go down, we'll make our next stop here. You can see the engraving, and then we'll go down. I'll meet you right down at the big rock there, but I'm going to stop halfway down and tell you the dinosaur footprint. Tell you a funny story about trying to understand the battlefield in a lot of different ways. Understand the shape of things, and the sickles line moved out. The 2 regiments were sent out by companies and squads, which is how they usually fought in that direction. So they probably stretched from the other side of the shoulder, big round top, all the way up probably to the glory barn, almost in front of the. But it's almost hard to say a skirmish line because these guys were used to fighting 2s and 3s, not lines of
And
battle.
they were used to fighting in the back, right? And all of a sudden they're in the front?
Well, no, they were used to just being sent out as skirmishers to harass and harangue and get intelligence, and because they had better rifles, better shooting, green uniforms, they wouldn't get discovered. It was their job just to bust up attacks before they got close, or force units online instead of in. And they did a wonderful job. A lot of the Confederate commanders said that you know, they really slowed us down, screwed us up, caused a lot of delay.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Tom,
Yep.
there's a pin on that rock over there.
Oh, is it? Is that where it is? Good. There's only 3 of them, I think. I don't think I've ever found the 4th. Because there's got to be a hole somewhere, right? Even if, or they blasted that rock later. I can't tell.
I don't want it's an artillery show.
Yeah, shell hit it. Yeah. I got to see it better with up. If the shadows weren't here, you can see that this mortar is a different color than this mortar, and this one's a different color from others. And this rock, when it's not dirty, is a different color. It's just got, you know, goopy with soot and stuff. But when the sun's better during the day, when there's not so much sunlight, you stand back there, you can see that it's even a different texture. You see a little bit on this one?
Yeah.
And this is a lighter color than that one. But the road used to be right here, and this gully wash is now. There's probably a boulder right here. Hey, run! So they had to come replace that piece. Yeah, from back here you can see it's a different color and slightly different. It's a smoother texture than the other two. And the mortar is a little thicker because it's a patch. It's a patch job. Oops! You did what?
They broke a monument.
Awesome. Teaches us to get actually good geology lesson. It looks like a giant chicken stepped right here. Because you see, here's a toe, a toe and a toe, and a little. It looks like his other big foot right here. Giant, whatever they call them in Jurassic Park. And so we were here one day staring at this thing going, man, that looks like a great big bird. You know, whatever they call it. So we took a bunch of bits of chalk and sketched them out. That looks like a 3-inch ordnance mark. And we sent them to the Pennsylvania. He's got a great paleontology department up in Harrisburg. And they kind of giggled and wrote back and said, well, it's not possible. I said, what do you mean? It's right there in the picture. They said, those rocks weren't formed in like 1 million years after the dinosaurs. Oh, never mind. But it makes an interesting thing for Boy Scouts because it looks just like what you would think. But in fact, these are, oh, here I go again. They're not really granite. And there's always a geologist who says, those aren't granite. It's diabase, boulders. And they form, well, in primitive terms, I guess you could say sort of from lava. They form from the boulders. And the rock devils ended up here were originally under dirt. And those are probably air bubbles in the rock. But, or artillery scars, you know. But then originally we were all probably all over the South Mountain under dirt, you know, whatever million years ago. And eventually the water found a path here, probably a good-sized river at one time, and eroded the dirt away from the side and part of the valley, leaving behind the stuff that water doesn't erode, being the boulders. So the boulders are here because these bubbles of lava, or whatever you call it, I'm not a geologist, lots and lots of years ago, formed under the dirt, and then the dirt fell on top of it, and eventually eroded away with the creek, and left boulders sticking out. So that's where Devil's Den boulders came from. Geology lesson for today. They were originally just under the dirt, and the sediment washed away, leaving the boulders. No, I'm all right. I gotta help myself. So anyway, leave the kids, send them after the dinosaur footprint, and then afterwards you do a little geology lesson, and you'll get all kinds of things out of the battle. Yeah, it looks just like a dinosaur. That one we think is, yeah, because there's one on the, actually there's one on the bridge over Plum Run over behind Big Round Top there. And actually there's another one that looks more like it than the one that really is. But apparently that came from a quarry somewhere else. And it's a different kind of rock. It's only about this big. And it's, again, that kind of three-toed bird-like thing. And that one apparently, according to geologists, probably is possible. It's about the middle. Going south Confederate up Big Round Top on the right side. It's about the most, you know, sort of like the or Sleepback, if you used to watch Land of the Lost. Yeah, it's like Godzilla. Rise battery. Wow, it reminded me of a day like this. This is amazing. No humidity or anything. Well, I bring you down here to show you real quickly the 16th Michigan's original position. You can clearly see the piece of concrete down here under the weeds. and it was eventually there and facing that way. But no one came to visit the battlefield down there anymore, and the trees and brush hid it. Everybody came to use the new road and come see the sunset, so they said, heck, we got to get that where it can be seen. And so they picked it up and put it there and turned the face toward the people coming to visit. Which again points out that a lot of times, thanks to Batchelder and the will of the veterans, the monuments are where people can see them, not where they were during the fight. The rule was very simple, and seldom did they break it. But when they did, they confused the bejeebers out of us, which we'll explain later. The rule was simple. The monument had to be placed where the unit entered the fight. I guess you could say met first contact, but where they entered the fight. And they were required, even the 84th that wasn't even here, to have flank markers. So they put the monument up and they put out their flank markers. Now here's the problem. Where did you enter the fight? And that was sort of open to interpretation. I'm convinced, though I haven't found it written anywhere, that the purpose for that was, where did the Confederates enter the fight? Way over the other side of the battlefield. So we can legitimately keep them away from the Union battle line. That's where you entered the fight. So the 16th apparently entered the fight by Batchelder's determination. He got to pick a lot of these places, somewhere in this area. How long they stayed here and where they really spent most of their time. Did they march here and then back up and form, or who knows? And of course, this too is the memory of people years later trying to figure out where they were. And that can be open to a lot of other sort of memory problems. But down below is the 4th and 5th Texas, and down over here the 4th Alabama assaulted this position. Now the 4th, as most of you know, was part of Law's Brigade, which began the day on the other side of South Mountain. Came through Cashtown Gap, which is off in that direction, and marched 25 or 30 miles to reach the monument where they began from, rested a few minutes, and then climbed, some of them the shoulder of Big Round Top, some of them the top of Big Round Top, to reach the bottom of this hill to begin fighting. And that's in old Army shoes, not Nikes or anything else. And they reached this position. Now the 4th, at the bottom of the hill, by the accounts of their officers, simply dissolved in among the rocks, because there was about halfway up the shoulder of Big Round Top here, there were no trees. And the reason for that is fairly simple, even though there's been lots of discussion. The valley was owned by a fellow who lived in town, and for years and years and years had picked it clean of lumber. And there was a sort of football-shaped piece of property which stretched right across, the property line was right across the top of Little Round Top, ran just into the Big Round Top a little, and then along there to Devil's Den, and along the top of Houck's Ridge, out in that direction. That's why, from the top of Houck's Ridge to the top of Little Round Top, there are no trees, because that was a guy's property. The Weikert's on the other side of the hill, somebody else on that side of Houck's Ridge, but in the middle, this person owned this property and cleared it of trees for firewood, fences, and so forth. And so, in the old days, there was a piece of cleared area, and as the 4th Alabama came down out of the woods, they were moving downhill against an enemy in an elevated position across the way and started to take fire, reached the bottom of this hill, and simply, as the officer said, dissolved. Found a rock to hide behind, and that's a good place for me. But by being there, they held in place the 44th New York from being able to move to one flank or the other to help, because they had to watch the guys in front of them. But few, if any, of them ever even started up the hill, much less reached anybody in combat up here. So the 44th perched, had a firefight for a good deal of time with the 4th Alabama at the bottom. Probably a better thing, the 4th Alabama may have inflicted more casualties than if they had attacked. Because from down there, you take your time, you pick a guy, you shoot him. Running up the hill, you're not going to get a shot off before you drop. And so the casualty lists there in the 44th are pretty bad. In the 83rd, they're not as bad. In the 20th, they're bad again. And so it has to do, the 20th was attacked regularly, the 44th was shot at regularly, and it's kind of interesting how the types of battle you're in inflicts certain numbers of casualties. But they fought over this ledge, and eventually the 16th retreated, the 140th joined the fight, and things stabilized here. And then about the time that Hazlitt opened up, the fighting with the 20th began. We know that partly because John Chamberlain, who was in the rear where I'll show you before, said everything started about the same time. He'd never heard a battle before. And he heard some musketry, and all of a sudden, boom! Because he wasn't very far from Hazlitt's guns. And you can imagine this kid right out of the seminary in Maine hearing a cannon for the first time. And the sound, he said, was just amazing. And all of it seemed to erupt roughly the same time. So we can guesstimate that about the time the 140th saved the right flank of Vincent's line is about the time the shooting in earnest started for the 20th. And then if you figure that the 47th and 15th Alabama went to the top of Big Round Top, that sort of fits. It's difficult to time. Nobody stood in sat in a helicopter above with a stopwatch and said, okay, that started, and that, And we try to recreate these things later, which is very difficult. So. We'll walk over down past the other triangular field to the Vincent marker. Yeah. The little miniature Washington Monument is the fourth main monument, and just the rocks right to our right of it and behind it. All that general area. In fact, you can see the boulders now.
Was that hit?
No kidding.
1B? Was that hit by lightning?
Yeah, a long, long time ago. Yeah, that's a lightning strike. There's quite a few of them up here because there's just nothing else to hit. It's a high point, and the tree all by itself is exactly what it is. Monuments get hit once in a while, but it doesn't bother us. They shrug it off. We'll walk over and see the Vincent marker now. Yep.
Vincent Monument.
There's Terry. Oh, here. I don't want to just start circulating when they'll never get back. Terry brought with him pictures of the original, which is over in Erie, of this monument. And you say, what do you mean the original? And they say, well, this one broke. Broke like right across here back in, I guess it was in the 1970s. This was placed in 1872, if I remember right. There's a lot of interesting stories that this monument helps tell. One of them is that it's backwards. Originally, the monument was placed turned the other way around because back then, everyone came to visit the battlefield from up there. But when they came to replace the broken one in 1980 or something, not very long ago, they replaced it with a new one, but everyone came down here to look, and so they turned it around because that's where people visit the field. But it looked just like this. It just cracked. There's a bad piece of marble in the middle or whatever. And this was the first monument placed on the battle. Warren is the first statue. And it says a lot about the early importance of Little Round Top in the memory of the battle because this is where the first stuff was put, by and large. And it was placed here, as I said, in 72. Now, here's some interesting things. This is another place. This is where Vincent absolutely fell. So they found that engraving and was like, well, it was around here somewhere. And of course, the 83rd Pennsylvania is back here, which Vincent originally commanded. And they're the ones that placed this, which leads some suspicion. So who knows? Somewhere around here he fell down. I know for a fact he didn't get shot in the hip right here from Devil's Den, because it just isn't going to happen. But unless he had one of those Warren Commission bullets. And Warren was here, so... Anyway, so this was placed here, and the new one was turned so you can see it. The original, if I remember, it's in Erie, and I can't remember if it's in the high school or the library, somewhere in Erie. And there's the Strong Vincent Highway now, and so he's gotten a lot of credit. Didn't make the movie very much, so he didn't get a lot of real adoration like others. But anyway, it was here. Now here's another interesting story about Civil War memory. One of the people who was instrumental in placing this marker was Oliver Wilcox Norton, who was a private and Vincent's bugler or flag bearer during the Battle of Gettysburg. And he wrote a book which has been heavily cited and used and interpreted called The Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. And it's useful in that it combines a lot of sources that had never been in print before, including Warren's 1872 letter about, or 1871 letter about, I saw they fired the cannon and all that kind of stuff. And Norton had also been instrumental in placing, in fact, I think he chaired the committee to place the 83rd Pennsylvania's monument, which is just down here. On top of that monument is a statue of someone who is not Strong Vincent. Yeah, right. Duh. When they went to place the monument, they sent a plan to the Park Commission, and they said, we're going to put Strong Vincent on the top. And they said, whoa, 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 wait a minute. First of all, he's only a colonel. Second of all, he only commanded a regiment. To get a statue at Gettysburg, you had to be a division commander. And if you were a corps commander or army commander, you got a horse. That's why Buford, the cavalry commander, is on foot. And the infantry commanders are on horse, because there was a sort of a rank to how you got a monument or not. And so you had to be at least a division commander to get a statue early on. Then the rule got broken, and then everything fell apart after that. So they said, you can't put Vincent on there, he isn't high enough ranking. They said, all right, how about if we just put a model Pennsylvania soldier on top of the monument? Oh, that's okay. There's a sharpshooter guy, and there's a cavalry guy. Yeah, generic guy. No problem. Well, danged if they didn't pull the canvas off at the dedication in this monument bears a striking resemblance to Tom Desjardin, but it's not him. It's a colonel with very long sideburns and he kept me in it. And years later, the 83rd veterans are still writing, you know, tongue-in-cheek, like, that statue. Well, that's not really him, you know. So they pulled a fast one and lied, cheat, and steal and got their statue. Now then, of course, the next guy came along and he got one, so and then the thing all kind of fell apart and everybody got one eventually, but well, almost everybody. And so Norton was involved in that, and this. And one of the people that Vanderslice wrote to when they found the engraving, what's this about? Well, in 1915, Oliver Wilcox Norton, who by then was blind, wrote a book, or had somebody help him write a book, called Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. That same year that it was published, he wrote a letter to the Park Commission, saying, by God, isn't it time we had something on the battlefield commemorating Colonel Vincent? Okay. So Nicholson, the Park Commissioner, wrote back and said, which of the other 3 monuments do you choose to obliterate in favor of this new one you want to put up? Norton was so, his memory was so bad when he wrote Attack and Defense, he didn't remember putting 3 monuments on the battlefield. And so if he couldn't remember this whole controversy about placing the Vincent marker, which isn't really him, or this marker, which then became a controversy because of the engraving, how could he remember anything about the battle? So when you read these books, oh, no, he knew Vincent, oh, they quote it and we cite it, the guy couldn't remember his name, for God's sake. He was 90 years old. He couldn't remember placing monuments on the battlefield. How could he remember which guy was standing next to him during the fight? So a lot of the stuff we think we remember about the battle is biased by adrenaline, guys who think they got shot when they didn't, and guys who were in Hawaii during the battle but claimed they were here, and guys who by the time they were in their 80s couldn't remember stuff. And so they wrote books not really remembering. Norton was one of those ones in Carol Reardon's new book, Pickest Charge in History and Memory. She talks about how Norton was among those right after the battle, within a day or so, said, no one's ever going to be able to figure this out. Some guy is going to come along someday and write a book and call it history, but he won't know the first thing about it. And then sure enough, Norton, like, oh, this wrote a book. And it's funny how she points out a lot of these famous people because they wrote books later. A day or two after the battle, writing to friends and family were like, oh, no one's ever going to be able to figure that out. And then they tried later. You know, they were sort of criticizing themselves before they wrote it. So the history of the battle is consumed by these inaccuracies and difficulties. But the thing about Gettysburg is there isn't a controversy about the monument at Antietam because nobody wanted to put many statues there. So they didn't have to have all these strict rules that they could bend and break and have trouble with. And there is something about this place, Gettysburg, particularly around Top and Pickest Charge, that create this whole new set of rules and guidelines and confusion and difficulty and make it much more difficult but much more fun to study because you have 10 accounts, all of which conflict with one another. And you have to try and sort it out. But all of that points to the picture that Gettysburg was much more important to people then and people today. They want to build a new business center at Chickamauga. Did anybody complain? No, they built this crystal pyramid. Looks real period. On the battlefield there. It looks really goofy looking. It's got this glass pyramid-shaped building. It wasn't glass pyramids in the 1860s. We want to build a monument, a visitor center here, and oh, the USA Today's got to make a big deal out of it. So there is some importance we have attached to this place that is unlike anything else, unlike Independence Hall or Valley Forge or any of the other places. And that's what makes it sort of fun, to watch people interpret it and write about it and visit it and talk about it. Even if they ask questions like, who hid behind that monument during the battle? Somebody asked about this is a good time, somebody asked about the walls. Now, they get confusing on the battlefield, especially over here. First of all, in the midst of a fight, with very little time to spare, a good long log goes a whole lot further to stopping a bullet than a rock wall. Because 3 guys can make a really big log move to protect 10 or 15 guys. To pile the equivalent number of rocks takes a long time. And a lead bullet stops when it hits a log, as long as it isn't rotted badly in. And so breastworks were more common in the short term in those days. Sticks, logs, stumps, and stuff stop bullets as well as rock walls, and rock walls took a lot longer. If you had the nighttime, then you throw up the rock walls. If you had nothing better to do, you might as well keep busy. And so some of these walls, including the 83rd position down here below us, were built, well, some of them were built on the night of July 2nd by the Pennsylvania Reserves and Massachusetts troops who filled in and replaced a lot of Vincent's men in anticipation of an attack the next day. Then they may have been enhanced again on the night of the 3rd in anticipation of another attack. And they kind of sat there in disarray, and years later, in 1897, when they built the road here, Sykes Avenue, the park decided, since we have this labor and these rocks, we'll build the walls up to about 4 feet, so that 100 years from now, they'll still be here. And we know they enhanced walls that had been here. They put walls where there had been wooden breastworks, and they put in some walls we just can't figure out, including some over by the 20th Main. So these walls are intended to represent some walls that were here, some wooden or log breastworks that were here, and some we have never been able to figure out what they were thinking. Then in the 1930s, the WPA and the CCC and all that government labor again came and re-enhanced them. And that was the time they re-enhanced a lot of the trench works on the battlefield. And maybe they moved them or put in some that weren't here or built them up. So the walls were nowhere near as tall and as sturdy as they are now. However, in 1899, Joshua Chamberlain paid his first visit to the battlefield since these walls had been enhanced. And you can imagine a commander who had been back and forth with all the controversies over who gets the credit for winning the battle, and being accused of getting too much credit, when he arrives and finds a 4-foot wall in front of where his men had fought, when they were only 5'6", 5'7" anyway. You can imagine how mad he must have been, seeing this thing that looked like his men had a fortress to hide behind, when in fact, he said in one description, they had nothing more than 18 inches high that a small man might lie behind. He was furious. And the Park Commission said, well, look, you know, we can't, even though that wasn't built when you were here, it was built during the battle, so we can't remove it. It's against the law. And years later, Nicholson actually said it was the hardest thing I have ever had to do as Park Commissioner is not remove those walls, because he understood they had nothing to do with battle action, but they were built during the battle. So it's one of those difficult things with a 3-day fight that you have to interpret. So to appease Chamberlain, because they needed his help to keep Oates from placing his monument, they put a marker, which you can see across the road down here, which to my knowledge is the only marker which corrects a misconception on the battlefield. And it says, this wall wasn't here when Chamberlain was. Well, not really. That's what it's there for. But what it says is this wall built for defense on the night of July 3rd. But in fact, it was built on the night of July 2nd. But in those days, midnight obviously became July 3rd, and so after midnight was the night of July 3rd, even though it was after, you know, we interpret things differently. But anyway, that wall was built right after the 20th Main went to the top of Big Round Top, and it was enhanced in 99 and again in 1940, and it was probably logs then, and it's a long story. But anyway, there's lots of these walls that weren't really here, but sort of were, but were logs, but weren't so big, and then those that we just can't figure out. The heck are those? Why would they have needed a wall running this way, facing that way? And so there's some that we never figured out. The CCC guys get a lot of control and said, let's get rid of these rocks, so who knows? A lot of it was road waste. When the road construction was done, they had leftover rocks. What are we going to do with them, man? Pick them up. One of my favorites is over in Culp's Hill. Gum semantics, even. There must have been a lot of lawyers of the veterans. Because in those days, they put up a brigade tablet, the black ones, the Confederate ones. And I can't remember the word, it might have been seized. But as most of you know, on lower Culp's Hill, the Union Army abandoned some earthworks to send, trench works to send some units over here from Culp's Hill, and then turned around and went back. And by the time they got back, the Confederates had walked into the empty trenches. And then there was that fight over Party Field, the Union Army took back the trenches later. To explain the movements of the brigade, I think it was a Confederate marker, Rob,
Maryland, yeah.
What's that?
Second
Maryland. They explained that, you know, they were at this point, and then they, I think it seized, captured the trenches or earthworks or whatever the word they used. Well, oh my God! Can you imagine the Union veteran who came, and he wrote 75,000 letters. How can you say I was in there? We didn't capture nothing! And so he's back, and they didn't capture it, by God, we gave those up on purpose, and we took them back. They're fighting over one word and one tablet. I guarantee you they didn't do that in Antietam or Shiloh or Cold Harbor or any of those other places. But one word on one of 1,000 tablets says captured instead of occupied empty trenches. Oh yeah, they ended up changing the tablet. Yeah. So that doesn't happen anywhere else. But something about the importance to them and to us of Gettysburg, this battlefield fought over every sentence of every tablet, every word in every tablet. And that's what makes these sorts of things interesting, that they never stop. And today, a quick aside, because we're way ahead of schedule, there was this big fight, even to yesterday, between North Carolina and Virginia. Virginians and Pickett's charge, and this is a great thing Carol pointed out in her book, because all the newspapers in the South, the New York media capital of the South was Richmond. There's no way North Carolina's going to get credit for anything. They lost more men here on the field than any other Confederate unit. Nobody knows that. So Pickett's charge, you've got Confederates over here, which are in Pettigrew's command, mostly North Carolinians. Pickett's command on the other side, mostly Virginians. And they march across the field and they fight. Big bunch of those Pettigrew guys turned around. Were they from North Carolina? They're Rocket Brother, they're from Virginia. Don't quibble about this. Don't quibble over that. So the Virginians pick on the North Carolinians for turning around, but it was actually Virginians who turned around. They go across, and of course there's the angle, 2 stone walls. Now the North Carolinians got further, but they didn't get over the wall, because it was further away. The Virginians got over the wall, but they didn't go as far. So who got further? So Virginians say, we get over our wall. The North Carolinians say, but we went further. So they're fighting because of the Richmond newspapers gave Pickett all the credit in the world, and none of those damn North Carolinians who turned around, who happened to be from Richmond. And so this fight begins. And North Carolina and Virginia back then, like Pennsylvania and New York, had always sort of had this big and little brother syndrome about who was the dominant political and social, cultural state of the region. And so there was a big fight, and eventually, to this day, it was 1990, I think, they placed the most recent North Carolina monument at the Angle. And if you go to the Angle, now, here's another thing. The Armistead Monument, the scroll where he fell, was placed by Virginians? No. Pickett's veterans made this great, big, beautiful monument to place right inside the Angle. But they didn't get permission first. They just built it. So they said to the commission, okay, we're going to put the monument there. And I'm like, no, you're not. We're putting no Confederate monument inside the Union battle line. This is Pennsylvania, boy. So they only get this monument with nothing to do with it. And they don't have garages to store them in back then. So they put it on Pickett's grave in Hollywood Cemetery, in among the telephone lines. So there's this huge Gettysburg monument in Richmond. So as a sort of an appeasement, 72nd Pennsylvania, wanting to claim all of the credit for the battle for itself, even though they had refused to charge when Webb told them to, but they captured the battle flags and prisoners because they ran into the retreating Confederates. Like, hey, stop! So they wanted more credit, and they wanted credit for killing or mortally wounding Armistead. So they say, we'll build a monument, and they say, how about if we, they're a Union regiment, so they can do this, put a monument to Armistead where he fell, which happens to be right in front of us. And so because of the controversy over the Pickett monument, they built this monument, wasted all that money, and stuck it as this huge tombstone down in Richmond. They got together, they were smart. They got some of Pickett's family members and friends to say, yeah, we agree, Armistead rather, we agree with that. So the Park Commission said, okay, you can put the Armistead monument there, but it's actually a Union monument. And it was placed by the survivors of the Philadelphia Brigade, most of the guys in the 72nd, who wanted to say we died there, or we killed him. And Batchelder wrote this account in the testimony over, there's another long story about the 72nd was supposed to put the monument here, then they decided to put it at the Angle, went to the state Supreme Court twice to move their monument 100 feet. And they didn't do that in Cold Harbor either. Anyway, in the testimony, the guy said, I remember why that marker's there. Really, why? Well, I was out there one day, we were with Batchelder, and I said, yeah, Armistead, where was he killed? Oh, somewhere over here. Meaning, somewhere in this 100-yard area. Well, he turned around and talked to a friend. Next thing he knew, he turned around and there's Batchelder. Having a stake in the ground. He's like, no, I didn't mean there. I meant here. Well, sure enough, a couple of years later, there's a monument there. This guy was like, I didn't say there. But the monument's still there because the 72nd one, hey, we killed him. So, anyway, this is how monuments get placed. Now, history gets written because of these controversies. Thankfully, Gettysburg is critically important to these people. We have Supreme Court testimony about who was standing where when Batchelder drove a stake. And gives us lots of information about the battle. In any event, if you go today and stand at the Angle and start in a sort of facing east and looking north and south where the North Carolinians and Virginians assaulted the Angle, stand at the Armistead marker, which is essentially the high water mark of Armistead's command, the Pickett side, and turn to your left, take several paces forward, and you'll see that brand new North Carolina monument just in front of that Armistead marker. And you know darn well that those guys from North Carolina said, all right, we're going to put our... Here. It's funny. funny, but it's true. Go look. And I've often said, if they keep this up, someday they're going to be all the way to Meade's headquarters. But that's how the veterans, and that's why this is huge, and the Pennsylvania Monument one-ups them and made a big cathedral, took a 12-foot high hill right off the battlefield to put it up.
And the Irish Brigade stuff out in
Oh,
Wheatfield,
yeah,
the stepping monument.
Exactly. And so there were rules originally, and the fact that there had to be rules says a lot about the importance of the battle, and then that the rules got broken along the way and fell apart after regiments had put up monuments. And it's interesting because the regimental reunion guys only had a fixed amount of money, and that's why so many monuments are here and so few Confederate monuments, really. You only got enough money for one, maybe two good monuments, and you're going to put it on the field where you want. A lot of Union guys put it in Pennsylvania because that was the one Union battle. If you're from Virginia, why are you going to go spend a bunch of money to put a monument on a battlefield in the north where you lost? So you put it at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Cold Harbor, or something, or Shiloh, something like that. And then later the states in the 50s and 60s of this century came and put the state monuments. But one of the biggest reasons there are no Confederate monuments is they lost. And this is Pennsylvania. We'll put them somewhere else. We only got so much money. We'll spend it where we won. And in Virginia rather than here. And the North, on the other hand, this is one of the very few battles they actually won during the war. So they put theirs here, and it's in Pennsylvania. So it has a lot more to do with that, really, than all the controversies that are claimed. But one of the poor... It's a long story, but Oates managed to disparage... He started a secret letter writing campaign, didn't put his name on any of them, but got friends of his to write letters about how the park wasn't allowing any Confederate monuments, which wasn't really true. And so this huge letter writing campaign in southern newspapers disparaged the Park Commission, and Oates got a friend from the Inspector General's office of the War Department to come look at the books here. Really, not the exact way you schmooze the park into giving you a monument, you know. Well, they came and inspected and visited, and finally Robbins, who was the Confederate commissioner, he was in the 4th Alabama, finally got so frustrated and rebuttal he said about where the monuments were placed. He said, do you think the Army stood still during the battle? Because if they wanted it here and there, and he's like, you can't put it there, that's just where we started. And like, well, we can't have these like running monuments and here and there. And so the controversies in the letters and the fights and the politics are really kind of interesting. And it was like anything then, as today with the visitor center problem. If you knew high up people in Washington, you got whatever you wanted. If you didn't get what you wanted. So a lot of this has to do with the power of New York and Pennsylvania politics and Virginia, North Carolina politics too, in Washington. If you got the president to say to the War Department, he's going to get his monument, he's going to get his monument, rules or no rules. And so that has a lot to do with it, even today with the visitor center. If the president wants that visitor center, it's going to be there. If he doesn't, it ain't gonna. Or anybody else in the chain of command in the Park Service or the Congress or what have you. So it's a lot more with politics than history, than the actual history. So let's scoot out across the road. I have to point out, too, that if any of you are from the area or know folks, one of the big successes of this Adopt a Position program, Charlie Fennell and Wayne Motts and I used to come out here with clippers for hours and hours until somebody asked the superintendent, can we use a chainsaw? And he's like, you mean you're not? And we're like, we used to go out with brush saws every fall. We'd come out here whacking and oh man, we'd never. And the next spring, the stuff at all, sumac grows like crazy. If you're a scientist out there, figure out a way to attach sumac genes to corn, and there'll be no more hungry people in the world. Because that stuff is amazing how it grows. And we'd come out here and whack it all down by spring and be back. And so the Erie group that comes and does, they're probably due to come because you can almost not see the monument, just devastates the nasty brush in this area and does a wonderful job. You could walk in this little triangular area about a year and a half ago, so they started, every year they come twice a year with a big group and just boom, all the brush goes away. Which is good because at the time of the battle, everything below the head of a cow would have either been trampled or eaten, anything green, because there was a lot of grazing here. Just ask Henry Hunt. And so the lower brush should be cleared because there was a lot of animal traffic. And in fact, Ellis Beer, the 20th man, remembers he saw their feet first. You could bend down and see people moving, but if you stood up, you were up above the head of a cow and there was more brush. So that they clear the brush is a good thing, because visitors can move around, and it's not so good about erosion, which we have to watch for too. Let's cross the road and go down to Real now. The leaves are starting to grow up, but down you can kind of see a big boulder through the rocks, through the leaves down here. The 20th Maine's aid station is like a chain of names for these things. Originally, when you're shot at the battlefield, you were carried 100 yards to the rear to an aid station, eventually moved to a field hospital. And the field hospital, of course, about the middle of the fight here, was set up at the Weichert House through the woods behind us, and that was the field hospital. On the field is called an aid station. And the big boulder down here, Chamberlain described burying the men who were killed instantly during the fight aside a great rock on a sunny hillside nook. And very carefully, in his main Gettysburg map that he did, he drew a circle right about where that was. When there's no leaves, you can see it better, but right about where that big boulder is a little pocket of ground, like a bowl in the ground. And when the Hard Day for Mother shot went off, he sent his brother John ahead. They didn't have a surgeon, because the real surgeon had given them smallpox instead of inoculating them from it. So he was unemployed about this time. The new guy hadn't come, so the Chamberlains asked their brother John to come visit, and maybe he could scrounge up supplies from the commissions and so forth. So John, as a civilian, was over here, and he picked a spot along with the hospital steward, and they set up, you know, what they could to prepare for the wounded. Which is why when he was there and Hazlitt started firing, a guy who'd never heard artillery was like, "Oh my God, that's loud." And so the 20th Aid Station was just down here. And eventually, I can't, 9, I think, of the 20th Maine were buried right there under the rock. Some of them survived an hour or so and got to the Weichert House before dying. But they left them there, and of course they were moved the next before November, before the dedication to the National Cemetery. But so their aid station was here, which is interesting because it tells us the limit of Oates assault creeping around the hill. Nobody went through that aid station because nobody there said, "Hey, the Confederates marched over us." Nobody from Alabama said, "Hey, we went right through their aid station." So we know they never got that far, and it kind of helps the interpretation of some. There are some who think that this line of rocks, which is construction waste, was the pile of rocks Oates was getting to, but the road wasn't built yet. So, but there's sort of a pocket of ground here where eventually Vincent and others were taken briefly before being taken off to the Weichert House. Because all it took was one guy at the Weichert House to run toward the line, spread the word, and everyone started headed for that direction, close by. But the 20th Maine's aid station, if you will, where John Chamberlain was just down in this pocket, and that's where the folks were buried after the battle. Of course, from here you can begin to see where the cars are. The road is, obviously the hill used to be like this. They would shave this part of the hill and flatten it out so that it would be like this. And the hill slopes are hard to figure sometimes now because they used to be gradual, but nobody knows how, just that they've been chopped. And you'll show that more on Chamberlain Avenue, which you can see. The old park dump is right there, too. Back in the 1890s, 1910, I think, they used to take down those old commission fences, we call them. The concrete and metal post and rail they used to use. Real period, isn't it? And they finally took a lot of them down. That was the dump right here behind the 20th Maine's position back in the 1910 or something. There's a lot of those on the battlefield today. It's just concrete and steel. It's not, you know, diapers and stuff like that. Beer bottles and so forth, but it's construction traffic. So anyway, that was just back in here, and each of the units would set up some kind of an aid station behind the area as a standard matter of practice. We're going to get on right now what was called Chamberlain Avenue, and we'll move down a little bit further and I'll show you. Because I wanted to give you a sense of road construction. If you look back this way, you'll see a very flat surface, which is kind of strange on the hill we've been walking. And you'll see, I think it's 32 feet wide, the road, with its culverts or drainage areas were. On the right side, you'll see it's built up, which is road waste and erosion control and so forth. So the hill was nowhere near that high. It was at least 28 inches, just the road bed, and then who knows how much they built up for support underneath. So at a minimum, it's been changed 28 inches. Well, if you look here, we're standing on Chamberlain Avenue, which took a hairpin turn back that way. Actually, it was one way toward us, not this way. And it came around the 20th Maine's position. But if you take 3 or 4 steps over here, like Moses part of it. Now I'm not on roadbed anymore. This is the original elevation. And you can see the difference. And this is on a fairly flat surface of road construction. They had this huge rock crusher and all kinds of equipment. Now, down on Sykes Avenue, between here and the rest of Little Round Top, in places it was 15, might even stretch it and say 20 feet lower than it is now. Because one side is the hill, and then you've got to build it up to flatten it out. So it used to go like this, and now it goes like this. And it was like a 6 or 8, 10-foot machine to hold the road in place.
Look at me, I remember.
So it's a good guess that the space between us and Little Round Top was a bit of a gully, because the road has filled that now. And if you look from where we're standing, the 20th Maine's right flank originally had to have rested probably where the brigade tablet is at the end of the road back here, because otherwise they just don't fit. There's too many of them. And now if you look down and you'll see the 83rd Pennsylvania's left flank marker way down in the sunlight down there in the trees. Well, I thought they were connected. Well, they are in Michael Char's book, but In reality, the 20th was here and the 83rd was like this. Probably because there was a big hole between them, and who wants to be in a hole in the middle of a battle? And so the 20th was probably placed on the high ground, which put them back toward the marker, and so was the 83rd, but that gully between them was left unoccupied because it was a bad place to be. But the Confederates were coming, everybody believed, from that direction. So facing them, there is no gap or hole. So it really, militarily, sort of wasn't there until the Confederates got around here. And these are all kind of guesstimations based on what we know about road building and holes. But there is actually one good topo map from the period showing Vincent Spur here as its own circle, meaning it had its own higher elevation. It wasn't this sloping up to the little round top. So that explains some of the reasons why the 20th and 83rd might have overlapped some, but not really, and there might have been a gap. When the 20th came on the field, their flag was down. Actually, the flag was probably right here where the right flank marker is, because the left was originally down toward where the monument is. And if you then go 400-odd feet, which they had to have occupied all the way, you almost crossed the road in that direction. And then, of course, Chamberlain being notified of the Confederates moving around and moved the flag to the left, and then bent the left back along here, where we'll get to in a few minutes. And so we're standing about in the middle of where the 20th originally was. So here's the question. The rule says, very carefully, you must place your monument where you enter the fight. The 20th main monument then should be right about where we're standing. And the flank marker should be across the road and where the monument is now. Because that's where they entered the fight. Which you very strictly follow those rules. No, they didn't. Because the monument's there, the right flank's here, and the left flank's in its bent back position. I'll tell you about the left flank more in a minute. And so, how come he got to bend the rules? And by what, how did Batchelder determine they could be bent, or what are they interpreting within it? We don't know. Because Batchelder sometimes would bend the rules and sometimes not. Mostly not. So how come, I assume that that's the position that the regiment was in just before it charged, and since that's its most interpretive moment, they let him put him there. But I don't know. And so it makes no sense. And the monument, trying to study the battle based on the monuments will drive you nuts in a short time. So Batchelder allowed the 20th to bend the rules, or he drove the stakes. And we don't know why, and how, and what he meant, and what he was trying to mean, and so forth. But now here comes a problem. This avenue was built in 1902. It was believed by some of the Erie veterans, and some of the Maine veterans, including Chamberlain, that Chamberlain had gotten far too much of the credit for what happened here than he should have. And it's a very simple thing in a way. Most of it wasn't his own doing, just the nature of how the story of the battle developed. But Vincent died at Gettysburg. And those of you who knew or are or have known veterans of combat know that the folks who come home feel very guilty, a lot of them, about the folks that didn't. Even if they had nothing to do with their death, they just, how come he died and I didn't? And there's a great deal of respect for those who die in battle. Well, Chamberlain survived the battle, and Vincent didn't. So you can imagine the anger of people in Erie over Chamberlain getting so much of the credit, whether he brought it on himself or not, and Vincent getting so little. They had to lie to put the Stille monument of him up on the battlefield. And then along comes this avenue, right where Vincent controlled the area, and it's named after Chamberlain, the guy who was lower in rank and survived, versus the guy who was higher in rank. They had to lie to get his monument up, and didn't. Now, who knows? Maybe the commission was mad about the monument. Maybe the commission wasn't thinking Chamberlain was alive. They thought, I don't know. They named it Chamberlain. And this became sort of Vincent Spur, perhaps in consolation for not being Vincent Avenue. And sure enough, in the 1930s, they took it out. Now, part of the reason was probably because Model Ts could take this hairpin turn, but bigger cars couldn't, and because by then Warren Avenue served the area. A lot of these roads were built to help the old veterans get closer to the monuments without having to walk. And then when they died off, they took them out. Mostly because of the hairpin turn. So there was a great deal of animosity in that time between the folks from Erie and the legend of, if not the person of, Joshua Chamberlain. In the 1906 and 1909 and 1915, folks in Maine actually appropriated the money to build a statue of Joshua Chamberlain. I'll show you the rock where they were going to place it in a few minutes. And that wasn't going to happen because the commission was like, oh, geez, now what do we do? Those people in Erie are already furious at us. They couldn't put their monument without pulling a fast one. Then we named it Chamberlain Avenue, and that set them off to no end. And now we're going to put a Chamberlain? What are you, nuts? Are you a glutton for punishment? Maine's a long ways away. Erie's just over the trains and roads over. So the commission's like, how do we get out of this? Well, lo and behold, Chamberlain said, no, don't put a monument on the battle. Because he was somewhat embarrassed about all the attention he was getting in light of Vincent not getting any. And so the historian from Maine kept pushing it and pushing it, and finally Nicholson wrote him a letter saying, look, if Chamberlain won't support it, why do you keep pushing this idea? It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do, not to tear those walls down and deal with these people from here. They'll go nuts if I built this statue up. And if he doesn't support it, let it go. And that was the end of the Chamberlain, even though the money was appropriated. And for good reason. The men of the 20th Maine didn't want to put one. Chamberlain didn't want to have one, so why should there be one? Well, because every weekend somebody from Maine comes and says, how come there's no Chamberlain monument? Well, he didn't want one. And there's a lot of very sticky veteran politics, some of it really poignant about who died and who didn't, about what this is named and what the hill is named and who got what monument. And so there's a lot in the history of what's written and in Norton's book and others that has a lot more to do with the controversies in the years after the war than what happened on July 2nd. And some of that is the touchy subjects about who gets the most credit or the least credit or what have you. So when Oates comes along and says, I want to put a monument in that bowl, like, yeah, like heck you're going to put a monument in that. I'm having a hard enough time keeping the Union guys straightened out. I'm going to put you in the middle of this mess. And he wanted to put it on this boulder just over here. Now you'll notice there is a photograph of that boulder taken in 1882, one of those lost tiptons. And you'll notice there is a hole, the Confederate burial trench. There's a hole closer to us away from that rock. In the photograph, there is a bigger boulder in that hole than the one that's still there. Oates wrote a letter to the commission in March or April, somewhere about there, March I think, of 1902, saying, I want to put a monument on that boulder. It's where I reached to, we'll talk about it in a little while, my brother died and so forth. And 3 months later, the Park Commission broke ground on Chamberlain Avenue. Mysteriously, that boulder is now gone, but that one stayed. My guess is that when they planned Chamberlain Avenue, which we'll talk about in a minute, nobody believed the fight was over here, which is really what it was at the time. And when Oates said it, they were like, oh, go on. You don't know what you're talking about. And so they left that boulder, I think, because Oates might want to put a monument until we decide that we better not destroy that boulder. But the other one probably became roadbed. We were standing on a minute ago. So that boulder, contrary to others, survived because Oates said, I want to put something there, and until they settled that, they left it. The other boulder got crushed, probably because they needed rocks for the road. That's a good place as any to get. So now there's this big hole, which one of the guys used to kid about being a Confederate burial trench, and that's a long story for another day. But, so Oates wanted to put his monument here, and into this whole mix of Chamberlain and Erie and Vincent and others comes Oates saying, I want one. And we're like, oh, God, now what are we going to do? But you don't find people on a, 2-acre square ground at Antietam saying, we're going to put this monument, that monument, you didn't, and we got one in it. But only at Gettysburg do you find this emotional connection by all the veterans to this piece of ground. It's a worthless little piece of ground agriculturally. There's no mining stuff here. You can't grow corn here. But because of what happened here during the battle, it became this really, and that's, when I say sacred, I mean 1.5 million people walk down this little path to that altar, we call it, and back out every year since 1990, since Ken Burns. We'll walk down and talk about the battle.
No, I don't mean the 20th man. I just mean the little roundhouse. Why it's really in the...
Yeah, and that's where the military, the strict military because we didn't know it was but if you sit down and read maps, think of these maps and look down and go, no way this is going to be a big map. Look at the blue around.
The idea that you're firing on over here, and that coming at you, it doesn't make any difference if 20 of them, 1,000, it's like, I ain't sticking around.
Well, the first thing is send as many guys as you can.
Right.
Six of there and fire. The 20th is originally in a position. Now there's a photograph taken in 1882 of their battle flag leaning against that, interestingly enough, white Maine pine tree right over there. There's a different tree then, but there's a white pine. And it says on the back, Ellis Spear wrote with his pen, this is the actual flag of the 20th Maine and the position it was during the battle. So it was there during the battle. Trouble is it moved 4 or 5 times, so which one did he mean? There's also a picture of the veterans at a reunion taken looking at us from back there, and the flag's in the same spot, roughly. One member of the color guard's got it tucked under his arm. And even then, it was just nothing left of the Gettysburg flag, and since then it's totally ceased to exist. But except for this little patch that I once had in my hand, which is kind of neat. Just over here where that rock is sitting, I think that's probably why somebody put it there, was the flag. And of course, you can see the Oates boulder, and the area where there was another big boulder in this photograph is gone. And if that was the flag, then that was it, the 20th original left. Makes sense, that's the high point where you can see a lot. And so it's the area where Chamberlain brought the flag and then extended the left that way to protect the sort of shape of the hill. And the shape of the hill is kind of the line was shaped like the crest of the hill. It's a fairly practical thing when you look at it. But it's a very smart thing. As little experience as Chamberlain had, he knew something was going on over in this direction, and he had the presence of mind to bend his men back to resist the flank attack from that direction. He knew that because Oates and Bulger, the 15th and 47th, were coming this way. And as they came down Big Round Top, the 15th and 47th were about like this. Of course, the 47th is only 154 men. The 15th had about 450. On the way down the hill, Oates thought he saw ammunition wagons, said to Company A, go capture those. Now, what ammunition wagons are going to do for a guy climbing a mountain in the middle of Pennsylvania, I've never been able to figure out. But he sent a company, lost 40-some guys off into the woods. At about that same time, Chamberlain's here and sends out a company of skirmishers, Company B, and he loses about 40-some men. So they both come in about 450. They both lose a company of 40-odd men. And those two companies are off in the woods for the time being. Now, Bulger, Company B in Baltimore, went about that way, looking for the 16th Michigan skirmishers, because, as I said earlier, on their way up the hill, the 16th was right behind the 20th. So my guess is the 44th was first in line, and then the 83rd, and then the 20th and 16th. And by all guesstimations, what probably happened is they got here, Vincent saw the front was nowhere near the front of the hill where the Confederates are coming through Devil's Den, and he came back here and the 16th was down in the woods. That's a waste. So he just grabbed the front of the 16th before it went into position and kept it moving along the back to the front, to the front of the hill. So when Walter Morrow went off, his orders were go find the left of the right of the 16th Michigan skirmishers, hook up with them, spread out, then the 83rd guys will hook up with you, spread out and so forth, and we'll have a nice brigade skirmish line. Very plain old typical military thing in the battle. Trouble is, there were no 16th Maine skirmishers because they kept moving, but he didn't know that. So down the hill he goes, look, down the bottom of the hill. They're out here somewhere. Right about them, very uncomfortable. The 47th came out of the woods about between the Warren Avenue sign, probably, just guessing again, and 150-odd feet to our right, because that's how long the line would have been. And they came out of the hill, down off the hill like this, the 15th and the 47th, but the way the tree lines were apparently, that brought the 47th into view first. So 154 guys come walking out of the woods. 400 men from Maine, a couple hundred men from Pennsylvania with nothing else to do but shoot at them. And so the 150 so of them are there with something of a crossfire, kind of in two directions, shooting at them. And they're getting blasted. Well, Walter Morrow's out in the woods, 16th Michigan, right here. Bang, 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 bang. Uh-oh. So here's Walter supposed to warn the regiment if anybody came, and now somebody between him and the regiment is shooting. Uh-oh. So when he starts trying to figure out how to spell court-martial, he says to himself, now what are we going to do? Well, he's still thinking 16 minutes. He hangs a left, and they run, about 40 of them, through the woods. The main body of the 16th has got to be here somewhere. Well, they never did find them, obviously, because by now they're way over here fighting the 140th New York. But they did find a stone wall, behind which was an open field you could see all the way to Hanover. They said, hey, here's a good spot to hide until our court-martial comes to get us. We can hide behind the wall, nobody's going to sneak up behind us, and we'll just wait and see what happens, because they're lost. There's nobody else out there. So, all right, well, okay, hide. Now, 12, 13, 14 sharpshooters in those funny green suits come bounding out of the woods. Oates had pushed them off Big Round Top, and they said, hey, can we hang out with you? Because we don't know where we are either. And Morrow's like, hey, more rifles, what the heck? You want to come to our court-martial and haul in? So there's about 60 of them behind a wall out there going, we're in a lot of trouble. And Bulger's down here, and that Company A goes wandering off into the woods, finds a stone wall, looks, sees Company B, and fires a volley maybe, and goes back. Of course, by the time they go back, the 15th is left and moved forward, so they're like, oh, geez, now where's the regiment? Well, we left them here. I knew they were here when I left them. So in the woods, you have two companies sort of locked, and you have big fight out of the wheat field, Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, smaller fight between roughly two brigades on Little Round Top, Over here you've got the 20th squaring off against really one regiment in the 15th. Somewhere in the woods, two companies, and I swear somewhere beyond that, two guys having a fist fight out on the Tawnytown Road, because it explains Longstreet's attack in miniature. The problem with Longstreet's attack is it was supposed to be a typical two-waved infantry attack that slammed into the enemy with great force and weight of numbers. When Sickles moved forward, the line got longer, and so Longstreet's line had to respond to get longer. And instead of being this hard punch, it became this sort of fizzled out, weak pop. And Oates' fight with the 15th is a good example of that. Instead of being this solid whack right into the 20th Maine with another regiment behind him to hit him again, it became this fizzled reaching for the flank, getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, until there was just no oomph anywhere left to fight. The real oomph of the attack was really in the wheat field, and that's the middle. It's supposed to oomph on the ends. And so the wheat field attack had success, but it didn't break or roll up. And Oates' attack is similar. He had to keep moving to the right to find the flank, and by the time he got there, he was too stretched out to have any force left. So anyway, the 15th comes out of the woods. Bulger looks up. My friend Bulger, what an interesting guy. Bulger was a 57-year-old guy from Alabama who opposed secession and almost hung him once. Ended up a political general, didn't know what the heck he was doing. The commander of the unit, probably for lack of military bearing, dropped out on the march, couldn't fight anymore. So here's Bulger. He has no idea what he's doing. In charge of this regiment, 57 years old, big blustery old guy, bald on the top, white hair in the back, in a strip kind of around here, all the way down past his shoulders, a goatee this big, but came down to here. Like a little elf, if you've ever seen a picture of him. But he was a big, stocky kind of guy, and everybody who met him remembered him because he looked so different. Which is neat, because I can tell you where he was every second of the battle. Because some Union guy was talking with him. This guy from Alabama just wouldn't shut up. I was in the field hospital. This guy was going on and on and on. And I was in a barn. He, we think, may have ended up in the barn here where Armistead died. Blah-bitty, blah-bitty, blah. But Bulger's standing there with these 154 guys who by now are down to about 80 because there's nobody else to shoot at but them. So you can imagine he's furious at Oates because Oates isn't making a target of himself to draw some of the fire away. So he's standing there exposed. Oates is messing around with the woods. So Oates comes down, sees Bulger getting shot at, looks at muzzle flashes, and goes, that's the flank. And since he's got to be around the last guy, he starts moving this way to get around that last man on the 20th, up here somewhere. Leaving Bulger to stand there and get shot at some more. So he gets down to like 80 guys left. And this guy rides up from law and says, why aren't you charging? And Bulger looks at him and is like, what are you thinking? And he says, well, and he swears a few times. He says, well, put Oates in on my right, and my life for it will take the hill. In other words, Oates is a pry. If he just don't yell at Oates, don't look at me. So he looks up and says, all right, well, now twice I've been told I got to charge. He pulls out his sword, takes about 5 steps, gets a bullet through the lung, goes down. At that moment, what was left of the 47th just dissolved, left. Turned around, went back where they came from, which happens frequently when a commander goes down. And so now there's Oates with no more 47th, a couple of 100-yard gap between him and the rest of the army, moving this way to fight. And the 20th, somewhat disconnected from the 83rd, who's really facing the other way, here to face it. 2 regiments having their own private battle back there. Now Bulger goes down behind a tree there, and later in the fight, Chamberlain years later remembered picking him up about where the point of that sort of triangle is under the road is about the area where Chamberlain remembered encountering him. Bulger was captured like 12 different people. They all claimed to have caught him. But it's an interesting story because here's Bulger laying there with a bullet, 57 years old, bullet through his lung under a tree, sword and pistol in his lap, waiting to figure out if we win, I get to go home in an ambulance. If we lose, I get to be caught. And he's sitting there because he can't move. End of the fight, some guy, I think it was a lieutenant from the 44th New York, walks up to him and says, well, you're captured, Colonel, will help you to the rear. By God, you can't capture me. Don't you know anything about military? You're just a lieutenant. I'm a lieutenant colonel. You don't have the rank to capture me. Which is funny enough in the first place. 57-year-old guy here, get away from me. But the lieutenant said, okay. And he left. Now, Bulger said the reason was he was trying to get him to leave so he could get up and escape, but he just couldn't get himself up because he was too badly wounded. So the lieutenant comes back 5 minutes later with Colonel Rice, now the brigade commander, because Vincent's fallen. It's like, all right, you're captured. Okay, you're officially good. All right. The lieutenant says, okay, come with me. Like, we got a colonel. And he's, okay, now I'm a colonel. Can you be captured now? There are these stories of Bulger like this forever. And he's shot through the lung, 57 years old, and he won't shut up. So anyway, it's interesting because guys like him help you piece together where people were sent to and how they ended up in places. And Chamberlain was probably like the 4th or 5th guy to come upon him. I'm sure the old guy had to be set down every few feet because he was having a hard time breathing as they tried to carry him. And Chamberlain came upon him, you're captured. You already captured me. Anyway, so Bulger was an interesting character, but when he went down, his regiment left, which is not at all uncommon. So Oates continued to move and eventually put himself across what is now the road in the reverse shape, I guess, of the 20th Wing, in a half moon or an L, stretching from this direction down around. And from that point on, the 20th fight involved the guys on the right wing here firing in a distance to the Alabamans down there, who never attempted an assault because, look, why would you? When this isn't the flank is somewhere over there. And so Oates took the other half of his regiment, and they repeatedly assaulted the hill from that direction, which is the part the commission never believed, so they built a road right through the middle of it. And they attacked repeatedly here. So if you were here, your buddy 50 feet away had a totally different recollection of the battle than you. So it's no wonder they had confusion. These guys fought at a distance with guys a long ways away and maybe ran out of ammunition. Those guys were charged upon repeatedly and maybe only fired 5 shots. So the battle was very, very different in such a short distance apart. So it's no wonder their accounts were different. Now the guys in the middle where we're standing, 88 of them came into the fight, 22 of them left, because they got shot at regularly and charged upon repeatedly. And one of the reasons Chamberlain said he put the colors here, he said, I placed it, I hated to do it in a flat open space, because that was just where it was supposed to go, but the 6 foot by 6 foot and a half red, white, and blue target in the middle, and the middle was just devastated by fire from a distance and by being charged on. So they got the worst of it. The further that way you go, the fewer casualties, until the last company had like 4, and the center company had 35. So it gives you a sense of the fighting being over here. Now here's something where we got to talk about our friend Chamberlain, contrary to the Ken Burns version, the Michael Schauer version. There's some things that don't fit into Hollywood's version of events very well, but they're important to know about him. Chamberlain had never, it's not an exaggeration to say he had never really seen a Civil War battle take place. He had been at Fredericksburg, second in command, but they had gotten themselves into a swale where the major fighting was up out of sight. They lost 6 guys killed to artillery fire, but they hadn't been in the fight. You know what it's like to give orders when this guy gets shot and that guy gets shot. Chancellorsville, they were all hiding or guarding telegraph wires because they had caught smallpox, and Chamberlain wanted so badly to get into the battle, he said, well, at least we can infect the enemy. And they said, no, get to the rear. So he'd missed that fight. He was so sick prior to the battle, he had been kept out of the fight at Middleburg, so he hadn't even been in that small fight. He'd never seen a Civil War battle. And this is like going to the Super Bowl and Joe Montana gets hurt and they say, you, get in there. And he's like, huh? You get in these giant guys in the huddle, he's like, what am I doing? And this is the sort of, he had no idea. He read about it in books, seen it from a mile away, been near it at Fredericksburg. He had no idea what he was doing. No training, what he could read from books and learn from Ames, and that was it. So then he comes to Gettysburg, so sick he really shouldn't have been here. For 10 days prior to the battle, he had been ordered by Vincent to stay away from the army because he was too sick. Go rest somewhere. And what he would do with his brother John was ride ahead of the army, find a house, get a meal, sleep in a bed. The army would pass by. He'd come up the next morning, pass the army, and play kind of leapfrog, so he could stay near it but not with it. On June 30th, he just, with the fighting near and the shooting at Hanover and everything, he had to be with the regiment. They had no lieutenant colonel. He was technically lieutenant colonel still. They had no major. So if he's not there, there's nobody above the level of company commander to run the regiment. And as I just mentioned about Bulger, it's kind of important there be somebody there. Now, Freeman Connor from the 44th New York had been brought over to command the unit at Middleburg, and in a big fight, which everybody knew was coming, he had to be there. So he dragged himself back to the regiment on the 30th of June. He said, by the way, the mail came, you're the colonel now. So technically, he was officially promoted the night before the Battle of Gettysburg. He was the least senior colonel in the whole army. No experience at all, and suffering from what he later described as nervous anxiety, stress, malarial fever, which everybody seemed to have at that time, coupled with diarrhea. Not the Hollywood version of events, I guarantee you. Charge! But this is what happened. Now, this is a guy, 5'6", 5'7", an average height guy. Now, in the movie, is he 5'6", 5'7"? Nope. Jeff Daniels came to me and I said, you know, first problem is you're about a foot too tall. You know, 6 or 8 inches, really. And he kind of laughed and he said, well, he said, what do you mean? I said, Chamberlain was only about 5'6", 5'7". He said, he's going to be 6'3". And it occurred, he said, some things even Hollywood can't change. And it occurred to me, well, yeah, he's a big hero of the movie. Do you want a 5'6" dark-haired guy? No, 6'3" blonde-haired, blue-eyed. So he went on to become Dumber and Dumber. Who cares? But the Hollywood version of events is the one we want, not the one that really happened. And so he's huge. And his brother Tom, who is really taller than Joshua, is much shorter. You get all like that. But anyway, the smaller guy lost a lot of weight when he was sick, malarial fever, diarrhea. So he comes onto the hill with two legs that aren't really holding him up very well. Vincent runs over and says, don't leave here. See ya. And he leaves. So now here's Chamberlain, disconnected from the 83rd, sort of. You couldn't see it really. No commanding officer. No officers below him who didn't have a company to worry about to say, hey, what do you think we should do? Nothing. Stuck on a hill. Nobody out there. Confederates attacking from what seemed like 2 or 3 directions, and he's supposed to hold it all together. Now, he did know one thing, and this is critical. He learned this from Ames. In the midst of the firing, stand up, get shot at, and look cool. If you look like everything's fine, they'll believe it is. Hancock, riding back and forth behind his line, got himself shot. Fellow in Devil's Den, the men must see us today. Because looking brave, looking calm, looking cool and collected meant the men kept together. Falling down behind a tree like Bulger did, see ya. The men of the 44th New York called Rice old crazy because he said his eyes spun counterclockwise in battle. And they had developed, they said, this sort of sense that, well, he's going to be useless, so we better fight better. Sort of reverse psychology, I guess. But it was, now the 20th had never really been in a fight either before, a stand-up fight, as they called it. And so they didn't know what to do, except the guys in the 2nd Maine who'd been brought in. So Chamberlain has to look like everything's fine. Because if he can stand back there and get himself shot at, the least I can do is hide behind this rock and shoot back. And that's the principle of Civil War fight. Just stand there and look like everything's fine. And if they keep, and you look, no problem, look like a Mort Kunstler painting or something, then they'll be like, oh, I guess everything's fine, no problem. But if you start going like this, like, see ya, get out of here. And so it was critical, he knew, to look the part. And if he could do just that, he would do well. Not to mention bending the regiment back and giving the orders and so forth. For a guy with diarrhea, malarial fever, 2 legs wobbly, no experience, and a guy who lived in libraries as an intellectual, who processes every teensy little thing into something much bigger, to stand here and deal with all this is miraculous, if you think about it, inside his brain. Whether he saved or doomed the Union, who cares? But inside of his head, this must have been impossible. No wonder he went home. In August, they sent him home for nervous anxiety. Stress. He was a mess because he had gotten through this. Okay, and I forgot he got shot twice. So both of these legs, which aren't really working anyway, but he's got to pretend they are, because everything's fine, man, no problem. Because he goes down, there's no lieutenant colonel, no major. He's it. He goes down, there's nobody who can take over the regiment. Except, like, the decision to go to the rear could take over the regiment. So he's standing there, and a bullet hits the rock or his foot right underneath his right arch. And if you've ever cut the right arch of your foot with Nikes on, you know how painful it is, much less old sweaty army socks and shoes. And so this leg's not working good, which wasn't anyway, and no problem, man, everything's fine. Then he got shot in the other leg. Hit the scabbard of his sword. Best decision he ever made was to buy the metal one, not the leather one. Puts a dimple, not a big dent in his sword, but badly bruises his right leg. Wait, did I get that right? Left leg. So now both legs are not working, but everything's fine, guys, don't worry about me. And can you imagine this guy trying to suck all of that up, process intellectually things that the best commanders are the ones who didn't think, they just reacted. And here's a guy who does exactly the opposite. Vincent is long gone. By now he's fallen. Somewhere over there through the smoke was the 83rd Pennsylvania. Where the hell is that 16th Michigan? Like, Morrill was supposed to be here. Where did he go? Where's Tom? His brother John, one of them could get shot. Imagine how his mother would felt if he has to go home without a brother. All of this stuff just on his brain, and he's trying to hold it all together. That is an enormously remarkable story. Anybody would have fallen apart and not been, hadn't lost any credit because of it in that circumstance. But that doesn't fit in the novel, and it certainly doesn't fit on the Hollywood screen. We don't want to picture a statue of Warren up there looking like this, and we don't want to picture Joshua with diarrhea, malarial fever, trying to stand up on legs that aren't working. But that's what happened. Now, to a lot of us, that is a much more interesting, useful to the Army in training story than the John Wayne down the hill yell charge. You're supposed to hold the hill when you run off of it, stuff like that. But it just doesn't fit our modern sense of heroes and movies and things like that. So the real Chamberlain story is, I think, just as remarkable, thankfully, because there would have been this big sign at the state entrance saying I wasn't welcome anymore if I ever tried to go home. But it is, to me, useful and just as heroic as Paddy O'Rourke, who really did pull out his sword and yell down this way and run down the hill. It's just different, and it's not something that you can easily portray in a film and still have people go, I want a Chamberlain t-shirt, you know, that kind of stuff. So, in any event, we'll move over to the Oates Boulder. Hour and a half maybe, nobody knows for sure. Shooting back and forth, charging back and forth, and we'll wrap ourselves up over here at the Oates Boulder before we go. A couple of things before we go to breakfast. As we wrap up here, I should point out too, those of you who are members of the Friends, that from where we're standing to the park boundary 3 weeks ago, well, I think I counted 25 yards from the monument to private land, to Pizza Hut potential land, until just a little while ago when the Friends, years ago, they bought it and donated this a couple weeks ago to the park, the land upon which Company B was, and the land over which the 20th Maine charged. It was private land. Theoretically, could have been a McDonald's until a few weeks ago when the Friends turned it over to the park. And so that was kind of, when I say, if you stand on the edge, you'll see the orange markers where the boundary used to be. It ain't far at all to where private land used to be. So the Friends have done a real nice thing there. The left flank marker used to be the last stone in the wall right there. If you go over, you'll see the chisel marks. There's even a mortar stain there where it used to sit. My best guess is that in the 50s or 60s it tumbled off, rolled down the hill, and it's under the leaves and dirt down there. But without an archaeological team, we can't dig. I do have permission to get the new one replaced. I'm waiting to hear from the governor of Maine. I'm making him pay for it because he's worth like $20 million. Lives across the street from Chamberlain's house in Brunswick. So I said, pay for the silly monument. Figured if they're getting off easy, in 1906 they were going to place the Chamberlain statue back here, and that was worth a lot more than the flank marker. So if they do the flank marker, we'll let them off. So fairly shortly it should be back. But before we leave, I want to mention the Oates Boulder here. Chamberlain Avenue, as you can see, swings all the way around it. And Oates remembered that this is the spot at which he reached, in his memory at least, in 1898 when he came, as a Brigadier General of United States troops, by the way. And he said, I was right here. And when I got here, a guy with our flag, the 15th Alabama's flag, got to this point. My suspicion is he tried to run right up the rock and wave it to rally the troops. And this was the farthest point Oates remembered getting, too. The 20th backed up in that direction. When a guy from Maine tried to grab the flag, and as he did, another guy from Alabama shoved a bayonet through his head. Now that, I'm sure, snapped an image in Oates' mind that stuck with him pretty heavily for a long, long time. But even more so, Oates turned to his right, and his brother, 10 paces away, his brother who he was very, very close with, they grew up the abused sons of an alcoholic father. His brother John ran off to Texas to bring him home when he thought he was wanted for murder. They were very, very close. And his brother was hit 3 times that Oates saw. He ended up with 5 or 6 bullets in him. And he died 3 weeks later in a field hospital here in town, but as far as Oates knew, he was dead right there. 3 paces away, their friend Bud Cody got hit twice. He died 3 weeks later, 2 days after, before John did, of 5 or 6 bullet wounds as well. So the bayonet wound, his brother, his best friend, and the whole thing comes apart right here. They made it to the top of the hill, they took the top of the spur, and it all collapses. And so Oates wanted years later to place a monument here, but he made a couple of mistakes. One, his whole approach was the bull on the china shop approach, which is the opposite way to approach politicians even in the 1890s or 1900s. And the other was that it was a monument to his brother. And there's no way they were going to put a monument to a Confederate lieutenant inside the Union battle line, because there were a whole lot of Confederate lieutenants on the battlefield, and before long you could skip and hop among the battlefield, never touch the ground if that were the case. And so he never got his monument, but it got mixed into these controversies about Chamberlain Avenue and Vincent Spur and all the other kind of stuff going on. But he wanted it right there, which is where he remembered, if his memory was good or not, his regiment reaching at its highest point. And then they went down, and much later, or shortly thereafter, the 20th, in an effort to restabilize its line, some of the men started down the hill. And when they did, the Alabamans started the other way. They had been ordered, when you get the signal, whatever that is, run like crazy back to the top of Big Round Top. That was the only order they had. And so down the hill come some of the men from the 20th Maine, a small group of them, who sort of started on their own by accident. And so some of the Alabamans start running. And if you're down at the bottom of the hill, and all of a sudden Joe and Bill come running by, you're like, well, I can wait and see what they're running from, or that's the signal. See ya! And so the Alabamans at the bottom of the hill, more and more and more of them start running as ordered back the way they came, because the 20th Maine is coming down the hill. By that time, the rest of the left looks down and goes, hey, they're running away. Hey, they're running away! And down the hill, the left went. Now, the reason it moved in a right wheel, which Chamberlain put in quotes in his report because it was the best military term he could think of to describe it, was because that's where they ran to. If the Alabamans ran that way, the 20th Maine wasn't going to run that way. They simply chased the Alabamans back where they had come from, back where Oates had told them to go. Which meant if you were facing on the left and the Alabamans had come from that way, they weren't running that way, then you went like this. And you chased them that way, and tripped over a rock probably. So the right wheel, which then Ken Burns turned into a textbook military maneuver, Chamberlain was a professor after all, was not a textbook military maneuver, or a door on a hinge, because the pin of the door hinge, which is sort of critical, is a 30-foot cliff, where the monument is. So unless the guys with the flag and old army shoes jumped down 30 feet, landed just right, and kept right on going, which isn't possible, there was no textbook military maneuver. And in fact, Chamberlain spent his whole life saying, I never ordered the charge. I was gonna. I was getting ready to, told a couple of guys, but I never yelled, charge. It sort of happened by circumstance. 30 seconds later, if he had gotten over here, it would have happened by order, so we're quibbling over whether he did or not, and it doesn't really matter. The fact is, the 20th charged down the hill, and in the midst of it, Company B behind the stone wall is going, hey, that's weird. What's that? There are Confederates running at us. Well, that's not unusual. Yeah, but they got no rifles. So what had happened was the Confederates that this first group of Mainers had chased dropped their guns and started heading for the rear. And as they do, they're running right at Company B. Now 30 or 40 of them got bottled up in a farm lane back there and caught. The rest ran into Company B and went and ran another way. So Company B says, now they're running away from us. And they say, maybe we won't get court-martialed after all. So Company B jumps from behind the wall and says, charge! As loud as they could to sound like there were more of them than there really were. And these 60-odd men, some sharpshooters, some 20th Mainers, come running into the Alabamans, some of whom had gone that way, and now they got to turn this way. And so as the 20th left swings down, Company B comes up and sort of joins the fight and clears them right out of the woods that the French just donated. So no wonder Oates thought there was dismounted cavalry and air support and tanks and everything else back there. Because the poor guy runs back this way, runs into Mainers, runs back this way, here comes the left wing, runs that way, and the right wing hops down, and they're everywhere. And essentially it was just this bizarre combination of Company B lost in the woods, and the left wing chasing them away, and this order saying, run away when you get the signal, and that's a good enough signal for me. And all these things combined to be what most military combat is, more chaotic than organized, nothing textbook. And they charged down, the Alabamans ran, and eventually the 20th stopped partway up Big Round Top and fell back. When Company A of the 15th Alabama fired a volley at Company B of the 20th in the woods, that lost company, blunted the 20th's charge, and then the Alabamans made it over Big Round Top until morning, and at 9 o'clock the 20th went up. So fights like this are much more chaotic than they are textbook, and we look at them in maps on pages, not in a soldier doesn't know anything beyond 3 feet in any direction in a fight. And you have to kind of put it back in that perspective, which is hard. And we know a lot more about the fight than they did when they were writing their reminiscences. And that's part of it, too. Bulger actually captured one of Hazlitt's guns, if you read his account. So, he took that battery. I mean, no, you didn't. But this is how, I've noticed with Bulger, whenever he was in a meeting at which women were present, the story got even better. It was sort of an exponential thing. But it was, those stories get better and better with newspaper articles and stuff. So, we're going to be late for breakfast, at which I'll be so I can answer any questions that you have. So we need to scoot to cars and get to the Dobbin House.
Thank you. Great job, Tom. Thank you.
The whole fellow up in Maine there, so great.
Yeah, he owns Chamberlain's...
Hear of that particular item of business, you'll have plenty of opportunities, and I don't want to hear about it, so. My tour this afternoon will deal with the critical cavalry operations that took place on the east side of Gettysburg. We'll talk about David McMurtry Gregg's fight with James Walker's Stonewall Brigade at the Brinker Hops Ridge fight in the afternoon of July 2nd. And we'll talk about what actually flowed from it, which was the fight on East Cavalry Field that took place the next day. I have made arrangements with Dan Hoffman to bring us down onto the Rummel Farm property. Mr. Hoffman's broken his leg and is on crutches, but he has assured me that being the trooper that he is, he'll be out there complete with his Spencer rifle, ready to talk about the Rummel Barn and to show you the various items of battle damage that you can still see in the barn structure proper. So we'll be doing that. We're going to make a few stops out there in East Cavalry Field, and I hope that by the end of the day you have a much better understanding of what happened out there as much as it painted you to admit it.